Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Hard Truths Podcast with Ashton Forbes. Today, I have a very special guest. His name is Tom Montalk. Tom Montalk is an expert in scalar physics. He is an electrical engineer and a physicist. He has written several books. We spoke a year ago, had a mind-blowing conversation about scalar physics. Now, I want to bring Tom Montalk back on to talk more about plasma, UFOs, aliens, and scalar physics. Tom, welcome back to the show, brother.
Hey, Ashton. Good to be back.
Thanks. Well, let's just jump right into this. Okay. I know some people are familiar with your background, other people are not familiar with it. Just give us a quick recap of what you've been studying for the last 15 or 20 years related to physics, engineering, UFO phenomenon.
Okay, yeah. So as a child, I had various paranormal experiences in Germany, stuff that nowadays you could call it potentially extraterrestrial, but I've also had various kinds of supernatural entity encounters as well, besides that, non-physical stuff. But anyway, so when I was 13, I decided to really started digging into what could be going on with that. So I read all the UFO, all the metaphysics, all the physics books at my local library. And then a couple years later, I started getting really into suppressed science. So I ordered all these information packets from rexresearch.com. And this is before the internet, so they advertised in the back of Popular Science magazine. So I got their photocopied information packets on Townsend Brown, on various free energy inventions, Wilhelm Reich, and the entire thing. So I started doing lots and lots of experiments back then. I didn't have the expertise or the tools I needed to do it properly, but I did try at least. I got into weather engineering using Wilhelm Reich's cloud busting techniques. And then eventually I went to college for physics and electrical engineering. So I only ended up doing 4.5 years of that because I realized going into academia, it was too political. And I didn't have the freedom that I would need to pursue these fringe things without always having to worry about covering my own ass from, ruining my credibility for looking into something that wasn't officially approved. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to do like graphic design, web design on the side, and spend my free time studying these topics, everything from alternative science to ufology to current events to, everything that could provide puzzle pieces as to what's really going on and what is really being kept away from us. And so over the years, I've communicated with thousands of people, including scientists, researchers, abductees, ufologists, any sort of truth seeker who's into this. And I've amassed a huge database of personal anecdotal data, plus, research things, many things that you yourself, Ashton, have been into and have been discovering over the past year. I've been heavily into a lot of that stuff too. And so that sort of allows us to converge our paths right now in this podcast.
Absolutely. So what is going on? After your research, after decades of looking into it, talking to people, getting experiences, looking into the science and the physics, what is your best guess for what's going on with the UFO phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think working backwards, it's you yourself know, your entire audience knows that the government, the shadow military, they have technologies that are decades, if not centuries, ahead of what is admitted within mainstream physics. So when I went to college back in 1998 through 2002, our textbooks, that stuff is Stone Age compared to the true science that these Black Ops programs have. Now, the question is, how much of that is explainable within ufology? In other words, how much of the supposed UFO phenomenon, alien phenomenon, abductions, and so on is actually the secret government being involved in these illicit, illegal programs? And I would say maybe 30 to 50% of it is nowadays. That it's quite a bit, because within the ufology field, there's not only the supposed thing as alien abductions, but there's also military abductions or MILABs. And there's many people, they're not all nutcakes or fruitcakes or anything. They're like, people with credentials that claim to be military abductees. And also on the anecdotal data, like I know people personally whose parents were in the military and they went on to go into working for the NSA or military, like naval intelligence or something. And they would have periods of time during the military service where they would black out and they wouldn't know what they did for that period of time. It's almost like they're indoctrinated into a black program. And then when they're discharged from it, all their memories of it were erased. Okay. Wow. And when you're involved in something like that, it's very easy for you to also be having an alter, install like an alter personality that can be switched on or off. And so you could be living a regular suburban life, And sometimes at night, you could be abducted using portal technology, similar to the MH370 type technology, where you can be taken out of your room, I mean, not like an entire airplane, but just your body, brought to an underground base, do what you do there in your alternate personality, and then be brought back by 5 in the morning to wake up an hour later. This is a sort of a common pattern, okay? And so within that field of abductions, there is definitely a human component to it, for sure, okay? But me, myself, when I was a kid in Germany, neither of my parents were involved in anything military whatsoever. I mean, my entire family had no association with the U.S. military. We did live in Germany, which did have U.S. military bases, but I don't see how I would get on their radar. And the experiences that I remember, they do seem to involve non-humans. Okay, I do remember the typical gray aliens. I remember something that was like a gray / reptilian hybrid. And I thought it was my imagination until I asked my mom and my grandma, like, was there anything weird that happened during those years? And they said, oh, yeah, of course, you're always talking about these gray men or these stone men that would be coming after you. All right. So it wasn't like me reading abduction literature and then like inventing memories, because my mom and my grandma remembered me talking about that stuff. So anyway, that set me on a long research path to figure out, okay, well, what's going on with that? So my personal hypothesis, is that if humans have the ability to develop very advanced technologies, and we've done it rapidly from like 1850s, where we had like horses and buggies, and then all of a sudden Tesla came around, and then the airship mystery sightings of 1890s, where clearly some group was experimenting with anti-gravity vessels even in the 1890s, okay? And then you go a little bit beyond that once you had quantum mechanics and relativity, and then the Nazis were they're probably the ones that were generating those Foo Fighters that certain airplanes were seeing. And they also had advanced anti-gravity technology and possibly free energy, maybe even time travel or time bending technology back then, certain allegations of that. And so things accelerated very, very quickly. And so you have to think about it. Okay, well, what if this track of acceleration keeps on happening for the next, 500 years?
Yeah.
How far could humanity go? You probably go to Alpha Centauri even right now using that technology, right? So the thing is, if there is life elsewhere in the universe at all, and they also have this acceleration curve, how impossible is it that at some point they could have done the same thing and now we are the ones being visited, even 100,000 years ago, a million years ago? So just, if humans can do it, I think other things can do it, and perhaps therefore they have been here for a very long time. So that's sort of my personal view on it. And the thing is, if you continue that thought experiment more and more and more, you start realizing, okay, well, then you have different worlds, different civilizations that all accelerate at their own independent rates, but eventually they collide. Eventually they, it could be like the Spaniards meeting the natives, or it could be the Spaniards meeting the British, like a parody kind of a thing. But either way, you get wars, you get competition, and eventually you get a kind of homeostasis amongst all these different civilizations where everyone knows their place and there's rules and laws in place and so on. So what if that has already happened and Earth is kind of in this heavily trafficked area, but almost kept isolated in a way, like some sort of a nature preserve or a zoo or something, and so maybe these things that are around, they're not just secret military things, but they could actually be humanoids or other beings from other worlds that are here for their own agenda. And I think the ones that have the most power would be the ones that would be the most involved in our affairs, because they would have the greatest ability to do so. And that could include everything from genetic manipulation to trying to take over the planet for themselves by our consent. So they'd be seeding a lot of disinformation, like, oh, the Greys are good and we need them, we need to hybridize with them. That's that sort of spiel. So when you start hearing these narratives about Greys wanting to hybridize with us and trying to infuse our genetics with theirs to create this superior hybrid that's half human and half Grey, well, you know what? Maybe that's not all government disinformation. Maybe that is an actual, genuinely extraterrestrial or some sort of non-human intelligence that's trying to do that. And if that's the case, then we've got two problems to deal with, don't we? We have one problem, which is the human corrupt military component, which is trying to hoard all this technology for themselves. And you have a higher version of that, which is more cosmic, right? So it's almost like two bosses in this video game we have to get through. We have to get through the human corruption element, and we have to get through this alien corruption element. So it's actually probably more complex and more difficult than some conspiracy researchers believe. That's my
I think it's a good hypothesis. Why? Because you've grounded it in logic and reason, which is, okay, we've got these technologies that are out there. Maybe they're free energy, maybe they're teleportation or portals, whatever you want to call it. Those two things are really the only thing that's holding back faster than light travel at the moment. And if you open the door to faster than light travel, now all of a sudden it's not so implausible that aliens would be here. You know, it's like now if distance is no longer an issue, maybe the aliens can come visit us, which is why I personally think that the technology will open the door to those bigger questions on what is the nature of the alien stuff. And people that have been saying, like, people are going to say, oh, he's talking about hybridization. The more I look into this stuff, the less in the woo I think. That's like the thing that's like the least in the woo, in my opinion, is that we've been able to clone people for like 20 years. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but under George Bush, we banned human cloning. There was just a story a few weeks ago of a guy cloning some kind of weird bighorn sheep and then hybridizing it as well, like some random farmer. So like we're in the point in 2024 where genetic manipulation, CRISPR technology is already reached complete mainstream.
Right.
I guess what I would ask you on a follow-up is, so what I'm hearing is that it's a combination potentially of technology that humans have figured out. Maybe we've got it from aliens or what have you. It goes back really far is what I'm hearing, maybe 150 years. And then possibly a combination of actual visitation or just non-human intelligence. You weren't super specific about it, but opens the door to a lot of different options out there.
Right. And I would say that I think if aliens didn't exist, if we were just left to our own devices, I do think that the trajectory that we took from the mid 1800s forwards, it is possible that we could have done it all on our own, because once you get to James Maxwell and his electrodynamic theory and you start expanding that just a little bit, that opens the door to anti-gravity, free energy, portals, time travel. So the potential was already there. However, there were certain things like semiconductor technologies, which they were really, really struggling with it until Roswell. Roswell crash happened. I think within 1 year, they came out with a transistor, finally, a working transistor. Maybe they just need a little nudge. And, some people theorize that Roswell, that was an actual alien craft, but that it was purposely crashed as a Trojan horse in order to seed advanced technology within human civilization. And, the question is why? Well, now we have computers. Now we got cameras everywhere. We got satellites watching us. We're on the eve of a global totalitarian police state, thanks to that sort of technology. Maybe that's what the goal was all along. I'm not sure, but some people have theorized that, and I guess it's possible. I mean, from what I know about ufology, abduction experiences, anecdotes, all the data, everything about it, these aliens are extremely clever. I mean, they're very clever. Not only that, but they're also, like with remote viewing. Okay, you can remote view not only other places, but also other times, the past, the future, probable futures, right? And so these beings, it seems to me that they have a very advanced ability of precognition, of being able to map out different probable futures and to adjust their actions and their adjustments to our timeline right now, just like the movie The Adjustment Bureau. They're able to adjust things right now in order to affect the future in a way that they want. Now, you would think, okay, well, if they have that much power, why haven't they fully taken over our planet? And I think it's probably because there are other factions that might cancel that out, that want a different goal. And so there's this Cold War kind of counterbalance happening, even at the non-human level, that is keeping things relatively steady up until a certain point. So it's pretty complex. I will say, I think overall human history has been nudged and managed potentially by non-human powers. And I just say that based on works like William Bramley's The Gods of Eden, which is an interesting book because he was a historian who didn't believe in any of this alien stuff. He just wanted to write a general history book. So he started digging into actual library archives in Europe and everywhere, like looking at these ancient records. And he started spotting all these anomalies that indicated either the presence of time travelers or something that seemed non-human, interfering with human history at key points. So it's an interesting book, because he ended up writing a totally different book than what he set out to. But that's usually how it goes. A lot of these people that are into ufology, they didn't start out being abductees or even believing in it. But once you start looking at enough data, you start to have to conclude that there's something going on. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be extraterrestrials. Yeah. It could be time travelers. It could be some sort of weird quantum phenomenon where you've got like parallel timelines and there's bleed-throughs going on there. Could be that. It could be some sort of interdimensional thing. And these things are not mutually exclusive. It could actually be a big spectrum of all these things that are going on. So
Yeah, I mean, the problem, I guess, is that there's so many things going on, and without a lot of evidence for some of these more, I'm going to call it esoteric concepts, but they're grounded in pure physics, like time travel, for
Yeah.
example. It's like without more understanding of like data and what's happening, how can we say whether or not there's a multiverse or if we're in some kind of deterministic timeline? You can't tell unless you have more data. But I love that you brought up the example of there's this guy that started looking through the history. He wasn't a UFO person. I like that because that's the same thing that happened to me. Is that I'm somebody that recently got into this topic. I said, what's going on with this? I saw these crazy videos. Let me learn everything about the lore and the history of everything. I always tell people there's three things. You need to know electrical engineering, you need to understand physics, and then you need to understand history. If you understand those three things, you will understand the whole nature of how anti-gravity technology and free energy technologies have been kept hidden from us. And the history is all out there. Like and we'll talk more about some of these scientific papers because I want to get your opinion on some of this stuff. The scientific papers have been out there forever too. I think that when you mention Maxwell as well, you'll find that almost everybody discusses Maxwell. And they say, look at Maxwell's equations. This is when we like really took the next step up. And then I love the idea too that I've always loved this idea of Roswell leading to some kind of technological boom, especially with transistors. I actually looked into transistors and like the history of this like 5 or 6 years ago when I was first digging into it, going like, man, did we really like find some alien technology and then just like give it to some university professors and then say that they invented it? Like it's plausible. It's not out of the realm of plausibility. Let me ask you a question on the UFO thing about Roswell specifically. Tucker Carlson was talking to Clayton Morris on Redacted last week, actually just a few days ago. And he brought up this narrative that I've heard a lot. I like to shoot down narratives and explain narratives for people that aren't as deep into this as you and I are. And Tucker Carlson said, well, if these aliens flew from another galaxy or another star system or whatever, and they have this advanced technology, how can they crash? Shouldn't they just be invincible? I hear this all the time from people. So go ahead, give me your debunk of the how do UFOs crash? That's me doing the air quotes. Argument.
Yeah. So there's really only two explanations that I can think of. One is that it was intentionally crashed to serve as a Trojan horse to give us a gift of technology that would end up being like a poison pill that creates this hell world that we're moving into, or we're on the verge of moving into. I mean, we still could. That's one. And the other is that they were shot down by technology that humans had that was more advanced than we assume, right? Because what we typically hear is, oh, during Roswell, they're testing, what was it, like microwave radars or something, and that destabilized their energy field, and therefore the ship crashed. Maybe they weren't expecting that, and therefore they didn't have a countermeasure to it. Or it wasn't even a microwave laser. Maybe it was something that they probably already knew about the non-human tech presence on Earth for a while, maybe even a couple decades. Because if you think about it, there was that the supposed crash in Italy in the 20s or 30s. There's some rumors about that, and the Nazis had their own thing already by that point. So by the time Roswell happened, there already was a black program. I mean, the Manhattan Project was already happening years before that, right? So advanced technology was already being worked on, and of course it was weaponized, so they probably used it on that. So that's another potential explanation. And the thing is, no, to come here from another world, even if they do, maybe they're time travelers, maybe they're from another dimension, to do that does not require invincibility. It just requires knowledge of key science and key physics. It's like if you don't have the combination lock to a massive vault, how much effort do you need to get through those vault doors? A ton, right? I mean, I don't know, you get to like laser cut it or something, try to get through there. But if you know the combination, you just do it and you're through the door. So the same thing with these sciences that we're talking about. If you go down that path, you got the easy path towards magical abilities. It's not so the problem is nowadays, if you don't know any better, you would think that, okay, well, the only way to time travel, the only way to do these fantastic things is either basically through general relativity, right? So you have to these giant, massive spinning cylinders that warp space and time. And for us to build that is impossible right now. There's no way we could build something that massive that spins that fast and warp space and time. But that's because you're trying to use the handicapped version of science to do it. If you know, for example, the relation between an electric field and a gravitational field, hey, well, there you go. You just have to pump up the electric field and you alter space and time and voila, right? You got it. So that's what the Nazis were doing. I think that's what Black Ops are doing, and that's probably what some of these alien things are doing. They've got a different kind of science than what the public has, and therefore it's way easier for them to do that than for us to imagine using our intentionally handicapped public science.
Yeah, and I would say that you're right. I would also say that it's even easier than that, is that, just because you've developed this technology doesn't mean you're invincible. That was I think your strongest argument there. It's like, okay, well, I've got this awesome iPhone that's more powerful than any computer from the 1980s, but if I put this in a cup of water, it's going to be destroyed in a few minutes,
Yep.
So everything has vulnerabilities.
Mhm.
And personally, in my opinion, I hadn't actually heard that it was like that there's possibility of decoy crashes or what have you. That's certainly possible too. But if everything's got a weakness, just like Superman's weakness is kryptonite. So
Yeah.
if these things are surfing on gravitational waves, then theoretically, if I shoot a scalar potential or a gravitational wave at it, or create a gravitational disturbance around it, it's like pushing somebody off the surfboard while they're riding on
Mhm.
the wave. They're going to fall off, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor because it's not magic that they're using. They're using technology.
Yeah,
So
it's not, they don't have the infinity stone. They're not just invincible. They just realize that there's some extended electrodynamics that we don't currently accept.
mhm.
Now, this I think goes to my next point really well, which is I always assumed, and I've researched a lot in the last year since we spoke, that if there is some suppressed science that's out there that related to UFO technology, it's going to be out there to be found. It's not going to be like hidden in a vault in the Vatican or whatever. Like, people will have been writing about it, writing theories about it.
Yeah.
And I think I found it. So I guess my first question that I'm going to ask you, I just realized, is you believe UFOs are real. I think we can just assume that UFOs are real. This is a UFO. What is the energy source for this UFO? Like, recently, we've been talking about there's these UFOs in New Jersey. Some of them are clearly just planes, but let's just assume that some of these are UFOs, and they're floating around in the sky for over a day straight,
Mhm.
and they're just hovering there. In your opinion, Tom, what could be the energy source that allows this to be possible?
All right. So if you asked me, let's say we have a shadow military anti-gravity craft that's there and it's staying in the sky for days, and if you ask me what is its power source, that would be easier to talk about because then we are strictly operating within the realm of hard science, even if it is fringe science. Okay, we're still operating within the realm of science. Not to get too far off topic, but once we start talking about potential aliens or non-human intelligences, NHIs, when we start talking about that, so earlier, remember you mentioned what was like science, electrical engineering, and history. If you know those three things, you can figure out a lot of this. Those are the three. Those are like three legs of a table. That's the minimum you need to have a stable table, right? But you can have four legs, you can have five, six legs. So what are those other legs? Well, in my opinion, some of those other legs might include occultism, mysticism, right? Stuff involving psi powers,
Okay.
subtle energies, etheric energy. So when we talk about the ether, we're not just talking about 0 point energy vacuum fields. We're talking about something that's even more fundamental than that, that ties into it. And that gets more into the realm of consciousness. So when people astral project, or they got near death experiences, or they experience telepathy or synchronicity, or all these things, it's still not magic. However, it's not exactly hard science anymore either, because, for example, take a synchronicity. Okay. When you get a synchronicity, if you get enough of them, you start realizing, well, wait a minute, reality cannot be this cold, deterministic machine that the university physicists tell us that it is. There's something more going on. It almost acts more like a collective dream with waking dream symbols that
Mhm.
communicate something, meaningful to you, symbolic. And when it comes to symbolism and symbolic meaning, like the meaning of something, that's no longer mathematical. You can't really map that out using variables because it's not mechanical. It is numinous. It is involving meaning. It's semantic. Okay, so it's a different field of dynamics than physics. So in my personal opinion, not to jump too far ahead, but I think that reality actually does consist of two parts. One part is the programmed physics like side of it, the deterministic, mathematical, geometrical stuff, everything that you and I have been talking about so far. That's what that is. And you can study it, you can engineer it, you can apply it. However, there is another component which deals more with, like, you could call it like the right brain of the matrix, or whatever you want to call it. It's where it's more symbolic, more meaningful, non-mathematical, non-necessarily geometric. Okay, and that's also a component of reality. And the reason why I bring this up is because it seems to me that after a civilization masters physical technology, the only thing left to master really is consciousness itself and these subtle energy fields that are almost like the underlying HTML code or machine code of reality. So if you run a physics simulation program on your computer, hey, all the physics are there, right? It's hard physics. You can simulate this, you can simulate magnetic fields, electric fields, and all the math works out. But guess what? The entire thing is running on machine code, which isn't even physics. It's software, it's programming.
Yeah.
So I do think that perhaps reality has a similar dynamic going on where you have the actual physics, but it's all programmed. And if you know the programming, sure, you can work within that physics. You can engineer things. You can program something to fly around. And so I think that some of these non-human intelligences, some of them are only operating within the physics realm, and that includes a lot of these shadow military projects. They're using fringe science to do it. Okay, and that's totally fine. However, that other component of reality, some of these NHIs, they probably have mastery over consciousness and the underlying matrix code to such an extent that they can probably reprogram physics itself directly from the root source code in order to hover or levitate or teleport or something like that. And if you don't have that conscious ability, well, guess what? You're stuck using regular physics, and that's what these shadow military groups have, and that's probably what some of these less advanced alien groups also have. So, right. So once again, going back to your question, you asked me what makes it hover. I think in some cases it is probably I don't want to call it magic, but it is it's a little bit beyond physics. You call it quantum consciousness, reprogramming of etheric energy fields, or something like that. That's the one thing. And then the other thing that's more like the hard science, and that's what we can talk about more because that's mappable. That's what you can write scientific papers about. And so as far as like energy sources go, obviously it has to be the 0-point energy field. It has to be that, clearly, right?
Yeah. I waited that whole time just to hear the final thing that I wanted to hear, the 0-point energy field. The only thing I would disagree with you on is that I think it all is real hard physics. I think we're just not ready to the point to accept some of it. I think that the logical conclusion, if there is a 0-point energy field filled with energy that's out there, an etheric energy you mentioned, I actually love that term, etheric energy. To me, that's what consciousness is coming from. I mean, it just like there's not that much stuff out there. So to me, it's like if there's this energy field that we don't see, but it's always there, omnipresent, everywhere around us, everywhere in the entire universe, I mean, there's got to be a connection there. It seems like it's unavoidable. And then this is what I would say to you. You mentioned a lot about simulation theory, et cetera. So do you believe in the holographic principle? And do you want to explain that concept to people just briefly?
Yeah, so there's different versions of the holographic principle. Like on the one hand, you have Leonard Susskind, and he wrote a book about he wrote some papers about the holographic theory of reality. But he's talking more about basically a fourth dimensional black hole that we exist on the surface of. And so just as you can have a two-dimensional sheet of photographic film that has a holographic image imprinted onto it and looks three-dimensional, even though it's a two-dimensional sheet, well, our 3D space-time with a dimension of time added to it, which is fourth dimensions, could actually be embedded in a higher space, but it's actually like the flat plane within that higher space, and we're just holograms within that. And I think there is truth to that, but that's still 100%. That's still mostly a physical model. So there might still, I think, in my opinion, there still could be a consciousness component to some extent. However, I do think that the more science advances and the more metaphysics advances, the more they converge upon a single, true, unified science. So it's a matter of semantics and philosophy. If you're saying that it's all science and I'm saying, oh no, it's partly metaphysics, it's actually more of a semantic issue than an actual factual issue. What do we call this? How do we call it?
Yeah, I mean, my view is like, okay, well, if there is this ether, and just like you said, I fully believe the holographic principle. You did a great job of explaining it, in my opinion, which is just this idea that on this extra dimension, we're all maybe even 1 point. The idea of like the one electron theory.
Right.
And therefore everything is right next to each other, which means the distance as we perceive is just a projection, an illusion that we perceive. And that opens the door to a lot of stuff that's considered esoteric, like remote viewing. I think the idea of consciousness and what even is life. Maybe we're all the same person, a lot of that. So I just find those theories to be quite elegant. And I find that physics theories that are elegant usually have the most merit. Generally, a lot of this stuff really is more simple than what people expect.
Yeah. And what people have to keep in mind is with the holographic principle, that's pretty much what quantum physics is. When they talk about wave functions are patterns of amplitude and phase in space. And if the conscious observer interacts with it, a single particle appears, or a system, an atom, whatever, it appears. Well, that's how a hologram works. It's a collection of amplitude and phase that's distributed over space. And when you shine a laser into it, it kind of decodes it, it gets modulated by it, and it generates a seemingly three-dimensional object that isn't actually truly there. It's all informational. So quantum physics and holographic theory, I think it's basically the same thing.
Everything being informational really opens the door to a lot of stuff, especially just the idea of teleportation, because it's like, now what even am I? If I'm just a group of information, then that information can go through a wormhole, like Leonard Susskind would argue. There's another theory that, I don't know if you watched my Salvatore Pais interview. He's, I think, been alluding to this concept that I just was listening to Nassim Haramein talk to Danica Patrick about. This idea that inside each proton is a tiny black hole. Have you heard that at all? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I was thinking about this earlier tonight because I was thinking about gravity as an ether flow, you know. And see, the problem is a lot of people think about gravity as, all right, imagine you got the Earth, okay? Earth is a spheroid, okay? And they imagine gravity being an ether flow coming in from other, radial spatial directions and pushing objects into it, okay? And that might be true, but it doesn't have to be that, not if we consider it from a fifth dimensional perspective, where perhaps instead of ether flowing in to it, it's more like at each height above the ground, okay, there is a different ether flow into time, into a fifth dimension. So it might actually be flow perpendicular to what we perceive as space. And there's different flow rates depending on the gravitational potential. So the closer you are to the ground, the faster it flows, or the slower it flows, depending on how you view it. So so I do think that ether flow relates to time in some way, and also to gravity, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it just simpler than that? It's just a matter of energy density, right? The more energy density in a region, you're gonna create a flow. So if you have less energy density region in this space right here than you have in this space, I expect there to be a flow where things are moving towards that. Just like it's just thermodynamics, just hot moves to cold, right? So more
right,
to less.
right, and that might actually be so basically you can have, let's say, 2 points. This one here, in the frame. So this one here, it might actually be flowing quickly through time, and this one here, it might be flowing slowly through time into the fifth dimension, into the fourth dimension. But if there's a difference between them, then there could be a transfer through space as well, not just time. And so then to our eyes, we see an actual flow, from along the x-axis or y-axis or z-axis or whatever, even though the flow is going from a point to another point, where each of these points are flowing into the fourth or fifth dimension at their own different rates. So we're talking about a fourth or fifth dimensional space of ether and flows that happen within that. So it's almost like some sort of a hyperdimensional fluid dynamics situation, I think. And I think some of that is needed to explain physics phenomena that a simple, everything flowing into a ball might not necessarily always account for.
So you think the black hole idea at the center of the protons somehow feeds into that theory? Is that what you believe?
Yeah, I think so, because the center of any mass is where all the gravity is pointing towards, right? So if gravity is a kind of flow, you would think that, well, it has to go somewhere. So what if there is an actual spatial flow? So if all this ether is flowing down and down into the center of every single mass, then where does it go once it reaches that? It has to go through a higher dimension and then back out into regions of no matter, into other positions in the universe. And actually, Paul LaViolette, one of his theories is that when you have a galaxy here and a galaxy there, when you got two galaxies, that space in between them actually has a positive gravitational potential. It's not zero; it actually bows out a little bit. So there's actually and it's equivalent to negative mass or negative energy. So you get this positive gravitational potential bump in between two gravity wells. Okay, so because by physics convention, whenever you have a mass, the closer you get to the mass, the more negative the gravitational potential becomes. But in between large groupings of masses, there's actually a positive gravitational potential. So maybe that positive corresponds to where the energy that flows into these black holes inside protons or whatever is re-emitted out from a higher dimension into the vacuum of space, into the 0-point energy field somehow, and that creates like a positive gravitational potential. But so I'm just talking about a flow loop that has to go through a higher dimension in order to account for where the ether flow even goes. That's what.
So do you think then in that model that energy is like a cyclical system, much like the water table on Earth, where energy is coming from the ether and going back
Yeah.
to the ether eventually? What do you
Yeah,
think?
that's very possible. I will say that even within mainstream physics, it is well known that energy involves cycling of something. Something on a quantum level is cycling, and that is what energy is. And actually, the cycling within quantum physics, they would call this quantum phase. So the quantum phase value is cycling like a clock. It's spinning like a clock. It's going from 0 to 360 degrees, 0 360 degrees, and it's spinning round and round and round. And the faster it spins, the more energy is present at that point. So when you talk about energy density is equivalent to the density of faster cycling rates. Okay, so that's what energy is. It deals with cycling through time. Okay, through time. But momentum within physics, that has to do with cycling through space. So when you get a spatial wave, quantum wave traced down in space, that corresponds to momentum. But if it traces out through time as a kind of oscillation, that has to do with energy. So energy and momentum, they're two sides of the same coin, and they have to do with the cycling of something. They don't know exactly what it is, but they think it's actually they don't know what it is. They just call it quantum phase, and they say, oh, it spins this way through space and this way through time. And that's energy and that's momentum. And that so it's kind of self-referential how they describe reality. Like they don't really know what work is or energy or force or gravity. They explain everything in terms of everything else, and they assign terms to it. And they don't ever go to asking the fundamental questions like what actually is energy, what actually is time, what is gravity. They don't, because they can't.
That's my favorite. It's like Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla invented alternating current. Nikola Tesla was a real person, by the way, guys. I used to think he was a myth. All he figured out was that if you take a copper wire and spin it through a magnetic field, current begins to flow. No, and people say like, "Oh, well, you're just converting the kinetic energy into electrical energy." What the hell does that mean? What's the conversion rate? Like, what are you talking about there? Is that so? If a wind is spinning a turbine, is the wind converting into electrical energy? That's not, is it really converting? Like from a conceptual perspective, it makes sense. You say, well, whatever energy I did here, I'm going to get energy out of it.
Mhm.
But from a broader philosophical perspective, it doesn't really make any sense. You realize that what's really happening in alternating current is that time is moving forward and time is causing the coil to be flipped, and that's causing the current to flow. It's crazy to me that the most fundamental question there is has not really ever been answered, which is where is energy even coming from? Where's the energy for these lights right here coming from? So
Yeah.
where do you think? So you think then that the energy must be coming from the ether? Do you think all energy is coming from there?
In a way, I think it's coming from time, but time in a way is synonymous with ether. Like what's his
Mhm.
name? Kozyrev, the Russian researcher.
Yeah.
He was researching etheric energy, entropy, time, and gravity, and he related all those to each other. He said that they're all part of the same system, the same complex. But I do think that etheric energy or energy in general does involve motion through the hologram. You could call it. It's some sort of hologram.
Mhm.
So imagine, it's like with animation, the old school animation. We got different slides, and you take a picture of each one, right? And you do that.
Hit the flip
Yeah,
book. Yeah.
yeah. So you can take all the slides or those sheets and lay them out spatially, and you've got yourself a spatial pattern. But when you play them through time, now you've got motion, and you call this motion kinetic energy, right? But really, it's a spatial pattern that's become animated. So
Yeah.
time and space, they are at right angles. They're orthogonal, but they're two sides of the same coin, in that you can be in between one, you can be more of one or the other, and largely it depends on perspective, right? So if you
Mhm.
have if you have an electron and it's stationary relative to you, it's got an electric field around it, and it's 100% electric. But if you move past it, all of a sudden part of that field becomes magnetic to you. So,
Hmm.
or if you take a magnet or a magnetic field and you move in a certain way, then part of it becomes electric. So there are things within physics, quantum physics, where if you look at it from the viewpoint of space time, fourth dimension, the fourth dimensional field, where you've got space here, you got time here, that entire thing, you've got these static patterns on here, static patterns. But when you yourself, as the observer, move through time, then it actually animates as motion or electricity converting into magnetism or whatever. In other words, there are deeper dynamics going on that explain physics. But the thing is, even if you ask a physicist, well, then why does that happen? Okay, well, then why does that happen? And so on. You keep drilling down. At some point, they're going to throw the hands up. They're like, I don't know. I've reached the limits of my language. my conception of my assumptions, I can't go any further. And at that point, it becomes a philosophical speculation as to what's actually going on. But yeah, it's wrong. It's wrong to say that physics is an explanation of reality. It's not. It's a hypothesis. It's a model of reality. It's an approximation.
Yeah, physics is the model. Engineering is the practical experimentation and the observation.
Yep.
So we should be looking at engineers to show us what's possible, and then physicists to explain how it is possible. But for some reason, it feels like it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you: with 0-point energy, are you familiar with Hal Puthoff's work?
Yeah.
The legend. Because it feels like I looked at his papers since we last spoke. And to all the questions you just brought up about, well, is this 0-point energy, this ether explaining gravity, mass, inertia? His papers say yes, it explains all of these things. It's not just him, but he also wrote some papers with Bernard Hayes and Ruda as well. And some of them wrote papers by themselves. It's clear these guys all know each other. So the crazy part is their papers go back to the 80s. The first one from Hal Puthoff was 1987. Which was the ground state of the hydrogen atom. And he asks the question, why does the hydrogen atom not radiate energy at rest? And it seems kind of counterintuitive at first, because you think, oh, it's at rest. It's not supposed to radiate energy. But then from the quantum mechanic perspective, we look at it, we realize that nothing's ever really at rest from the quantum mechanic perspective. If you were to take a pendulum in quantum mechanics, it never stops. Even, we look at something, it looks like it's stopped, but it's never really stopped. So the conclusion he came to is that, well, it must be interacting with a field of energy where it's gaining energy and losing energy at the same rate in equilibrium. And that's why it doesn't appear to be radiated energy. He followed it up 2 years later and wrote what I think is probably going to end up being a legendary paper in history, which is gravity is a 0-point fluctuation force, where he's basically saying that the relative energy densities that are out there create this pressure that we know of as gravity, which was basically what you just explained a second ago regarding this etheric flow.
Yeah.
He just says it's a matter of relative energy densities, which that was me just kind of stealing his arguments. And then it was Haitian Ruda later on that came up and said, well, this also explains inertia. Like, why do we feel resistance when we're moving, even through outer space where there's no gravity? Why do I feel resistance? Well, the answer is because you're moving through this field. Like you would say with the hologram, it's like you're moving through the hologram. And when you do that, we feel this resistance is there. And if you were to remove that 0-point field, then you're not going to feel that resistance anymore.
Yeah.
They also said that this 0-point field is what gives us mass. It's the reason why we have mass at all. Otherwise, we would have no mass. What do you think about Hal Puthoff? You think that those theories are sound? I mean, this guy is connected to the UFO topic in a way that I never could have anticipated.
Yeah, so I like a lot of what he's written, but I'm also equally suspicious because someone who's that well connected and that smart is also capable of putting out BS to throw people off track. So I'm careful. I'm careful when I read his stuff. I'm like, yes, this makes sense, but I'm going to reserve just a little bit of salt, just to make sure, just to make sure that I don't swallow it fully. And I mean, the same goes with anyone else that's involved in the higher level stuff that has secret connections. They could be running interference for black programs by throwing people off track. They could be. But it's up to us to understand it and to see if that is the case or not. I mean, it's not a good idea to have a blanket suspicion and just not believe anything. If you're not going to believe something, if you're going to have a suspicion about it, explain why. Like, find out why. What is off about it? And if you can't find anything, then hey, guess what? It checks out. So that's how I've been with Hal Puthoff. And I mean, I like that he's open-minded enough to explore things like the vector potential and the scalar potential, the force-free version of those that don't lead to magnetic and electric fields, the stuff that I talked about in my last podcast with you. So he does talk about that, and he talked about it decades ago, so he's one of those guys. It was him. I mean, there's others like Tom Bearden, who's, talked ad nauseum about that sort of thing. So it's a thing that keeps popping up, but it never really broaches into the mainstream. For good reason, because academia is sort of a it's gatekeepered, it's gatekeeped. So there's just really no way to penetrate it. But
have you seen his patent by any chance?
Yeah, the vector potential and communication system. Is that the one you're talking about?
Oh wait, let me Yeah, this one right here. So I'm just going to read it for the people listening. First of all, just called communication system. If you're trying, so I agree with you. We have to be skeptical, and we should be judging arguments based on their merits, also not based on if somebody did remote viewing in the 70s or whatever crap too. But when someone's putting disinformation out there, I don't think they usually call their patent something really vague like
Right.
communication system. Like what? And so then you read it, and I want to get your take on this. I've said my take many times, but a communication system using vector and scalar potential is disclosed. The system uses field-free potentials, like you just said, signaling for many applications where the absence of shielding effects in seawater, plasma, or other dense media due to the fact that the absence of the electric and magnetic fields eliminates the possibility of induced charge and current response to the media being transited. So real quick before I let you jump in here, is that when I read that, it says we're using field potentials that have no electric and magnetic field, like the Ehrenhoff-Bohm effect, transmitting a scalar potential through the ether, through the 0-point energy field. And we're doing it because electromagnetic fields are blocked by seawater and plasma, which to me says this is a communication device for communicating with a submarine or communicating with the sun or something, some plasma ball, right? Last thing I'll say is that this patent is not just one. There's 5 different patents with different patent numbers. All are the exact same thing. And they date all the way back to 1993. And I found a news article about this patent, and the mainstream academics were up in arms about it. They were incensed over the fact that this patent had been approved. They claimed that it was pseudoscience and that the patent officer must not have known what they were talking about to approve this patent. But we can see it's been approved 4 other times since then, most recently in 2021. So what is your thoughts on this patent?
I know. I think it's legit. I mean, it just uses an expanded version of Maxwell's equations. Really, I mean that's all it is. Because so the Maxwell equations that we know nowadays, what they are is they relate electric charge to electric fields to magnetic fields when they're both in motion, and so on. So they relate one electromagnetic thing to another. Okay, but the thing is, to get to that form, they had to cut out a lot of other things that were implied. But they were like, well, that stuff isn't physical, so let's just set it to 0 or make them cancel each other out. So we don't have to worry about that stuff. It's all imaginary anyway. We can't measure it. We can't prove it. It doesn't matter. So let's only focus on this little part. And that became the 4 Maxwell's equations. And that's what's taught to every physics and electrical engineering student nowadays in college. Okay. And they take it for granted. To them, it's like the 10 commandments. They don't question it. They just follow it. Okay. And so when you tell them that, hey, what you're taught is false or it's incomplete, they're like, oh my God, that's blasphemy. Right. So a lot of these scientists, they're criticizing religion for not being rigorous, but they themselves act like priests. They act like Pharisees or something. So anyway, point is, if you expand Maxwell's equations and you don't use what's called the Coulomb gauge or the Lorentz gauge, if you don't use those things, which is just those are ways of setting the divergence of the magnetic vector potential to 0. Okay, that's called the Coulomb gauge, or setting it to be the opposite of the partial time derivative of the voltage with respect to time. Either way, either cancel the scalar effects out, or you set them both to 0, and you're only left with ordinary non-scalar physics, and that's what electromagnetic theory is nowadays. So anyway, if you don't do that and you leave those things intact, and you leave them alone, and you incorporate those scalar things, then what you realize is, well, wait a minute, I can create fields that don't have an electric field associated with it or a magnetic field associated with it. All you have is a more deeper fundamental vector potential and scalar potential that normally give rise to those other fields, those main fields that we know. But in this case, you're not giving rise to them. You're just leaving them alone and having them be what they are. So I sort of got into this in my last interview with you, where I talked about how the electric scalar potential, when there's a gradient in it, because remember earlier you were talking about when you got like a difference in thing, you got a flow between it.
Yep.
Well, the same thing. If you got 1 voltage here and you got like a lower voltage there, then you have a gradient in between them, and that gradient creates an electric force field. So you can think
Brown effect, right?
Yeah. So the electric force field, you can think of it as a kind of accelerating ether flow, between a positive charge and a negative charge.
It's an asymmetry in a dipole too, right? Any situation where you've got more charge on one side than you've got on the other side.
Yeah. Well, yes. And also, if you have a dipole where you got like positive charge and negative charge, if So imagine one is like a leaf blower and the other one's like a vacuum cleaner, right? So
Mhm.
one's blowing and the other one is sucking in air. If you mount them on a stick and just leave them alone, they're actually going to move through the air because it creates like a flow around the entire thing, like a smoke ring, like a
Yeah.
solenoid. And a smoke ring travels through the air because it's sort of like swimming its way through the air. That's what a smoke ring does.
That's why smoke rings are doing that? Huh.
In
Yeah,
a
I
way,
realize that there's a lot more to smoke rings than what people have assumed. Like, there's a specific reason for why smoke rings form the way that they do and the fractal nature of when they kind of fall apart as
oh
well.
yeah. And you saw videos, right? You probably showed it to your audience where smoke rings collide.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's super cool watching them collide, and then they have this, like, 90-degree, like, where they make a smaller fractal
yeah,
version of themselves, and it's consistent
I know.
every single time. Um, what I wanted to ask on, the Thomas Townsend Brown, actually, let's go. I want to actually change gears here for a second. Actually, I want to ask you before I forget, and then I want to jump in and show you a video. What did you think about the UFO hearing? So, given all this information, this knowledge about science, your understanding of this technology, your research into it, your research into the alien phenomenon, non-human intelligence, what do you think about that hearing?
I think it's a token gesture towards the idea of disclosure. Because if they really wanted disclosure, they could do it. They probably could. But the thing is, they put it out there in these little crumbs to so these people that are giving testimonies, right? They can only say so much before they start running into national security issues and NDAs that they've signed, and that's why they're always like, "Well, I could tell you about this, but no, I'll tell you about it in a skiff because one of the secured things." And then when they finally get into the skiff, they give them some BS, and then when they come out of it, people ask, "Well, what did you say in the skiff?" And then, "Well, we can't talk about it because it's classified." So the Congress people, they get blocked, and these people testifying, they can only say so much, even in a skiff. So it's ultimately, I think it's a clown show. I think it's so on the one hand, it does add an air of credibility to the UFO subject, like, oh, there's people in
Mhm.
uniform talking about what they've seen. And I guess for the normies or the people that are getting into ufology for the first time, it's good for them. Like it introduces them, it softens them up to the idea that hey, there's really something going on. So that's good.
Yeah.
But for like the seasoned ufology researchers, we're like, oh my god, this is so elementary. Like, why are you not going where you should be going? Okay, but to their credit, they are going further than they ever have before. Like all these other prior UFO flaps and stuff going back decades and decades. Yeah, it's more. But then again, I mean, you think about like Stephen Greer and the Disclosure Project in the early 2000s.
Yeah, he's been
Some of
saying this
those, yeah,
decades.
yeah. Some of those witnesses that came on and talked about things that's way beyond even what's going on currently in these congressional things. But then again, the current congressional thing is more official because back then it was more like okay, just get some publicity, put him in Congress, and have a big appearance of it. But nowadays, it's a little bit more has more teeth nowadays, but still not fully there.
What do you think the national security issue is that they can't talk about? By the way, totally agree with you that the big issue with a lot of these guys is that I don't think they're necessarily dishonest people,
Right.
but they've just run into competing incentives where they now have NDAs. They can't speak about stuff. They would literally go to prison over it.
Yeah.
What do you think they're hiding?
Couple things. One, advanced technology, including admitting to what degree they themselves have some of that advanced technology. Because the thing is, if there have been crash retrievals, as David Grush and all these others have been talking about, there are crash retrievals. Well, who retrieved it? Shadow military, the secret government. They've been using it. And so, therefore, if they've been using it, have they developed some of that technology? And the answer is yes. And the next question is, well, what have they been doing with that technology? What about these military abductions that use portal technology and for
Mhm.
mind control purposes and sexual, trafficking purposes and so on, gun running and all that? Well, it leads also to a lot of liability because they used it to get up to a lot of no good, a lot of illegal things. And not to mention, and I'm not the first one to point this out. Others have pointed it out that if you have one company like Lockheed Martin or something that gets access to this tech, but then another group like I don't know Boeing or something did not get access because they weren't in with the crowd. Well, then Lockheed Martin, over the years they get billions and billions and billions of dollars of profits from that, whereas
Yeah.
the other ones might have to shutter their doors because they didn't. Right. So if that truth were to come out about what really happened, they would have grounds to sue based on this preferential treatment. So there's a huge liability risk to any of this coming out to all the people that were up to no good in this field. So you got that. You got also just the fact that the whole like ontological shock to humanity. It's not just the existence of aliens that's the issue. It is what they have been doing, potentially in collusion with certain black ops groups, illegal stuff that is just inhuman. And if that were to come out, yeah, it would rock a lot of people's worlds, and also the economic consequences like free energy, anti-gravity, and all that. It would wreck most of the economy right now. You know, maybe for good in the long run, but in the short term, yeah, it would get really ugly.
I was actually going to ask you, like, or I was going to bring up the question about the civil liability, because yes, the criminal liability is one big aspect. That's the flashy aspect. Like, who have they been killing, silencing,
Yeah.
quieting these free energy engineers and stuff like that? But there's a less nefarious side of it too, which is the civil liability, which is that, oh, maybe it's not just the government and the military with this technology. What if it's the defense contractors? And what if we gave Lockheed Martin this technology like 50 years ago? Mm-hmm. Now we're in a sea of crap where it's like, how do we get out of this without, you know, and there's people who are accountable and responsible for a lot of this stuff that happened. Like, the amount of legal issues are just huge. And then the bigger thing too, I love that you didn't bring up aliens at all, even though you're somebody that absolutely, I think, believes that there's alien phenomenon happening here, is that you look at it and you realize that aliens aren't a national security issue. Of course, I mean, at a higher political level, it's a political issue that you have to deal with. But unless they're threatening to destroy our country, it's not really a national security issue. The national security issue is the impact of the technology, like you pointed out. Like, what would free energy do to our society? Yeah. Potentially would change everything. If we could leave the planet and go through a portal to Mars or Andromeda or somewhere, like, what does that do to our civilization? And those are the positive outlooks. Yeah. There's people as well, and I want to get your thoughts on this, which is Sal Pais, in a statement that he made, and then also in the interview I did with him as well, really alluded to this idea that we've been developing technology to basically fight back against non-human intelligence using a form of their technology that we have advanced in a way that they won't be prepared for. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a pretty crazy idea, but I've learned to not doubt the man at this point. And it speaks to this idea of a prison planet, that basically we've been reset, or we are being held down. And maybe after we reach a certain level of technological advancement, in come the others and reset us back down to zero. What is your thoughts on that philosophy, that mindset?
Yeah. So the thing is, our technological progress has been, it's definitely been accelerating. And I think it would, like, as I mentioned earlier, it would have still continued even without any help by non-human intelligences. Okay. So I think it was still going to accelerate upwards. And the problem is, when we get beyond a certain point, we start infringing on their asymmetric power advantage. Okay, I'm talking about these alien civilizations or factions or something. So we become a threat, but at the same time, for some of these highly efficient predatory factions, we also become an opportunity, because if we become sufficiently technologically advanced and they gain control of us, then we are advanced to run our own prison planet for them. You know, once we got satellites, when we've got chips in our brains and, you know, cameras everywhere, AI monitoring our every move and our every thought, we lock ourselves down. And so we kind of, you know, wrap ourselves up in this birthday wrapping paper, put a bow on it, and hand it over to this controlling alien civilization, and they don't have to lift a finger. I mean, you know, to be highly intelligent and highly efficient and highly predatory, that's what that would involve. It wouldn't involve like doing a blitzkrieg on a planet and taking it by force. You would do it through subtle manipulation, but possibly over centuries, you know, manipulating religions, belief systems, political ideologies. I mean, for all I know, Marxism was invented by something non-human to fool humans. You know, something smarter has to fool humans in order to create something that fools most smart humans. And the same thing with like string theory, for example, right? String theory, what was his name, Witten or something like that. The people that came up with it, oh man, they had to be so smart to come up with that theory. But if the theory is false and if it is deceptive, then they have to be even smarter than these 160 IQ PhDs that study string theory for their entire careers. You know what I mean? You got to be smarter than the smartest humans. Yeah. So the deception system that is in place, whether we're talking about archaeology, genetics, physics, you know, technology, engineering, it is so well crafted that to me, it seems to me that it would have to have an even higher superior intelligence to craft it to fool our best and brightest for so long. So that's another reason why I do think that aliens might have had a hand in some of the suppression, because obviously they would also stand to lose from us developing, let's say, free energy anti-gravity, because when we'd be able to go to their territories, we'd become problems for them, right? We become problems for them, whereas right now we're nicely tucked away on this little blue marble, and we're not really a problem, and we're like a we're like a nice fish pond that they can just, hey, come by and take a little fish out when they need to. And but once the fish grow legs and start arming themselves with guns and start going on their lawns, then that becomes a problem. So
That's what scares me though about that, is that yeah, like it makes sense. Is that you would wait until they've reached a level where they're a threat, and then you would just come down and wipe them out. Or if you're smart, you don't even need to use force, like you said. You just psychologically manipulate the movements of the civilization, kind of like in the first Batman Begins movie, where the evil organizations, like, we used a new weapon, economics, to take down civilizations. And you look at what the CIA already does, and you go, they already do these activities.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The CIA guy, Kevin Shipp, he was just on with Candace Owens. He even mentioned the MH370 videos, and right before he did, he mentioned how the CIA's basic motto is like, it's a matter of plausible deniability. Is like, they can do anything they want as long as they don't make the government look bad. And you realize something like that is possible, and you go, well, why not non-human intelligence? Maybe they are manipulating us behind the scenes from the shadows, like the little puppet masters, so to speak.
Yeah.
It even speaks to Plato's cave, the shadows on the walls instead of seeing the true reality.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you know what? Before we move on, like, think
yeah,
about this.
please.
We think about the government or the shadow military reverse engineering alien technologies, right? So that's pretty much accepted within ufology, that sort of thing is happening. But what about them reverse engineering alien methods of control? Psychological control, cultural control, political maneuvering, and so on. What if they learned from that as well and are applying it to us? Maybe that is part of the basis of why the CIA operates the way it does. I mean, CIA traces back to, well, to several things, but also some of the Nazis that were brought over from World War II, and
Wow.
there's a lot of rumors about the Nazis having had interactions with non-human beings to get some of their technology and so on. And that's why they accelerated so quickly between like 1930 and 1940s. Who knows? Who knows? I mean, maybe there's something to that.
Yeah, the Nazi thing is really interesting to me. It was something that I wanted to dismiss as kind of a conspiratorial. People are trying to connect dots that don't exist.
Mhm.
But then you find out about Operation Paperclip, and you find out like Friedberg Winterberg was one of the guys that was brought over when he was like 15 from Project Paperclip from Germany. And he studied under Werner Heisenberg, like the Heisenberg of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Oh, and by the way, he also believes in a Planck ether or a hypothesis, which is basically exactly what we've been talking about, and this whole 0-point energy field thing. So
Yeah.
I've wanted to dismiss it, but the more we look back, the further this thing really goes. And it does go back to like even the early 1900s, which does make you wonder if there's something else at play. I don't really know where it's coming from, but it's interesting.
Well, I was listening to an interview recently with Eugene Podkletnov.
Oh,
You know
yeah.
him, right? Anyway, it was an
In
interesting.
superconductors, by the way, for people that are out there, and basically was doing the same stuff Ning Lee was doing in the 90s of researching YCBO superconductors for anti-gravity.
Yeah, if you guys want to like check out what is the latest cutting edge in publicly accessible anti-gravity,
Yeah.
I would point them to Podkletnov, because he's an experimental physicist. So experimental means you're not just pen on paper, you're actually doing it for real. And he's got it. Like, and so he was asked in the interview how he began, or how he discovered this sort of stuff. He mentioned, I think, if I remember correctly, that his dad during World War II got access to some of the papers that the Nazi scientists
Really?
had developed. Yeah, some of those patents and papers and things like that. And so Pakletnov during his early years was trying to study those, trying to reverse engineer it, trying to figure out how it worked. And then it took him like 2-3 decades, and he finally got it. And so that's why he was even doing the experiments that he was doing with like rotating superconductors and other rotating things, because he was trying to apply what he reverse engineered from some of these Nazi papers about flying anti-gravity ships and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, spin and magnetism, especially superconductivity, is it's quantum effect on the macroscopic scale. So it shouldn't be surprising that it's connected to this, especially if the universe is electric. Do you know when that interview happened? How long ago it was?
I'm guessing a couple years. I'll
Oh,
link you.
that's not that bad.
I'll link you.
Yeah, send it to me later. That sounds great. Um, Now there was an interview that I want to share just a few minutes of the clip with you that was on Project Unity's channel 4 years ago. And so this predates my emergence on the scene of the UFO phenomenon and what have you.
Mhm.
And I listened to this and it sort of blew my mind. Just to set the background for it, it's from somebody who just calls himself Mr. X. You can hear their voice. They don't use a voice changer or anything like that. If you know who they are, please let me know. Um, and they talk about the Sapphire Project and Hal Puthoff, and they talk specifically about plasma. More specifically, they talk about exotic vacuum objects, which is something that Ken Shoulders discovered in the late 80s, around the same time that Pons and Fleischmann made their announcement of cold fusion. And this guy, from listening to this, he's clearly in the know. This isn't some random person off the street. Like, he knows these people, he knows all the players. He's clearly worked with some of them, but he also sounds like a pretty young guy. There was a specific part in this interview, a couple parts actually, that I thought were just huge moments. But one part I thought you needed to listen to here, which was really interesting. So let's go ahead and play this for you. So here is the video, Mr. X. Here's the clip.
A paper online called A Brief Introduction to Scalar Physics. His name is Thomas Menderle, and it's called A Brief Introduction to Scalar Physics. It's a great document, and he has done a ton of research where he lays out how gravity, mass, inertia, even time itself is controlled by the scalar and vector potentials. And he has written a very good paper on this, and he has a website at montalk.net, montalk.net. And there's a section on scalar physics. But this guy has posted a lot of information, and I think he's a genius. And he explains this with illustrations and graphics so that the ordinary person can comprehend it. And and one thing, a couple more things about the flux line I want to mention. What's so critical is there's a lot of talk today in ufology about UFOs require these super advanced metamaterials with nanolayers.
Yeah.
That's not required to build anti-gravity vehicles. And I don't think all UFOs had such exotic metamaterials. Some probably did, but I don't think they all did. I think the idea that we have to master the production of these exotic metamaterials to produce an anti-gravity craft is a flat-out lie.
Do you think? Sorry, I was just going to say.
Okay, so first of all, wow, you just got a little shout out there. Have you not seen that?
I didn't know that he did an interview with you. Was that your interview?
Or no, that was an interview with Jay.
Oh, Project Unity. Okay, Jay.
Project Unity, yeah. And this is again from 4 years ago. And all of a sudden he starts talking about scalar fields, and he name drops you. I think right before that he started talking about Maxwell's equations as well, like everybody seems to.
Has he ever reached out to you?
No, he has not reached out to me. I would love, if Mr. X is out there watching, I would love to talk to Mr. X. And then I let that play for another minute or so because I wanted to get your feedback on that claim. This is something that I've been struggling to reconcile, which is when you talk about the energy source, is the energy source external, like the 0-point energy field, or is there some other fuel that they have that is somehow getting around the limitation of E equals MC squared, and the faster you move something, the more energy it takes? What is your thought on and this also speaks to Bob Lazar and element 115. What we're really getting down here is there an element 115, or we'll just call it mysterious fuel source, or do you think it's just directly coming from the environment, the 0-point energy field?
Yeah, so personally, I don't really believe in the element 115 theory. I mean, obviously, element 115 can be produced in the lab, and it has been. But I don't think, but I don't think that it's something that's mass producible and that it plays a role in an anti-gravity ship as Bob Lazar claims. And he himself, when he claims that stuff, I think he was going off of recovered memories because he had some weird memory. Remember earlier I was talking about people going to the Black Ops programs and they come out of it and they don't remember what they did during that time when they were in. Well, that's a common thing, and if Bob Lazar is legit, then he probably underwent a similar sort of memory wipe procedure, and so therefore anything that he does remember, either it's incomplete or it could be a screen memory that was put there to cover up for the real thing that actually happened. Possibly, I don't know. Okay,
Yeah.
so I don't know if element 115 is a real deal, but I would say that there are different types of technologies for producing similar effects in terms of time warping, propulsion,
Yeah.
getting free energy. There are different methods, but they're not an infinite number of different methods. It's you can sort of categorize them into, oh, okay, you're using this principle of physics. Okay, this one uses that principle, and they're closely related, but they're slightly different. Especially when it comes to propulsion. Like for example, the Townsend Brown stuff, the Biefeld-Brown effect. That's a different mechanism from what Podkletnov was doing with his rotating superconductors or rotating magnetic fields. They both lead to propulsion, right? But they're different. And Mr. X, yeah, I'm familiar with that individual. He's talking about the flux liner, the ARV, the Alien Reproduction Vehicle flux liner that Mark McCandlish was talking about. Yeah, that's an interesting thing because if you look at it, you see different components. So you can sort of start to guess how it works. Like, for example, there's a coil around the top, and then there's a rotating disc in there. So that's a homopolar generator. Okay, that's what that is. And then at the bottom, there are these crystalline capacitor layers, like in a fanned grid array, sort of like that. And they're probably Biefeld-Brown gravitators. That's probably what they are. So like high voltage gravitators that could be like changed in direction, combined with some sort of a homopolar thing, which I don't know if that was just to generate extremely high currents or if it functioned additionally for its own reasons. But there's a certain logic behind various propulsion methods. And the same also goes for energy. I think in some cases it is definitely tapping it from the 0-point energy field. Just that, but here's the problem. When you tap it from the 0-point energy field, you are changing the 0-point energy field in your local region.
Yep.
You're changing it. You're extracting, you're converting energy from one domain to another domain. And so therefore, one domain goes up and the other domain goes down. And so that can lead to some very weird effects. Like, for example, one example that comes to mind is a guy named Leon Sprink, Sprink, Leon Sprink. Have you ever heard of Leon Sprink?
I don't think so.
I think he was a chemist. I don't know if he was Russian or French or something, but this is like many decades ago. Anyway, he figured out a process where if you construct a wooden frame and you put electrodes in there at an X pattern electrodes, and you give it like 150,000 volts, and you just kind of let it run. If you let it run for hours, if not days, all of a sudden you start getting an expanding field of altered ether, you could say, where chemical processes would go way faster than they would normally. And so he used this process in order to speed up chemical processing of cement, like a cement factory, when they're making lime or whatever they make for making cement. He was able to use this process to alter the ether itself in order to alter chemical processes to, speed up industrial production.
Wow.
Yeah. But the reason why I mentioned that is because his arrangement of electrodes was doing something to the ether that was altering it. And one of the effects was alteration of chemical processes. Now, there are other alterations that can happen. You can have alterations where the weather itself gets disturbed. And there's on rexresearch.com, there's an article about David Wells, W-E-L-L-S, David Wells. He's a guy who tried to replicate the Newman machine, the Newman free energy machine, which is like a big, massive
Newman.
Joseph Newman. So Joseph Newman, his free energy machine, which is a big coil wire with like a rotating magnet on the inside to generate electricity. And according to Newman, it generated more power out than in. And he almost got it patented, but basically people working for the Men in Black, Men in Black in quotes, shut it down, and they denied him the patent.
In the 70s, I think.
Yeah. So, but the thing is with his device, David Wells tried to replicate it, but he did it differently with like rotating magnets and like a different kind of coil situation. He found that his machine, when he turned it on, it cut a hole, like a not a hole, but a channel through the cloud layer in the sky above. Yeah, consistently. It would open up a hole, like wherever the sun was and the machine was, the path in between, a hole would open up. He found that effect. He found that water bottles in his refrigerator and beer, like in the bar across the street, they would burst because they would freeze at regular refrigeration temperatures. Now, I did an experiment a couple of years ago where I had a rotating aluminum disc and a magnet on it. It was for a different experiment, but I was just like testing eddy current effects and like magnetic dragging and so on. Well, whenever I did that, stuff in the refrigerator would undergo some really weird changes. Like water bottles that I put in the freezer would not freeze. They would become super cooled. So they wouldn't freeze. They would stay liquid even at like 5 degrees above zero, Fahrenheit. Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. And eggs would explode and like would freeze, and they're above freezing temperature, but they would solidify and they would crack the shells, and just other weird stuff. So there is a kind of energy that affects the ether that alters the, I'm guessing, intermolecular forces, probably changing the very constants of physics themselves. The electric permittivity, the magnetic permeability, those things can be altered depending on the properties of the ether itself. And there are methods of altering the ether, and some of those methods happen inadvertently when you try to tap energy from the ether. So certain free energy devices, they're not just spitting out energy, they're probably also altering the local etheric conditions, which then affect the physical constants of physics.
Yeah, and this is where I wanted to get into the next clip from the same Mr. X interview. So, and we're not going to have time to watch it all, so I'll just give you and the viewers kind of the framework here. Is that they talk a lot about exotic vacuum objects. Exotic vacuum objects are balls of plasma Ken Shoulders discovered. From my research, specifically, I would say Paul Sis is the number one witness. He's now dead, died in 2013. He was an aeronautics engineer. He spoke specifically about hypersonic vehicles and crafts, and they use a plasma sheath, and this is how they reduce the drag in front of them. And actually, it has this propulsive effect to it as well. I speculate that we figured out at some point around when Ken Shoulders was doing his research that we don't need a craft for a spy plane anymore. We can use a ball of energy with some mechanical device in the middle of it to get all the same effects that we want from our spy plane, but we can get it now in a drone, and possibly even using Hal Puthoff's patent, which literally says in it that it can communicate through plasma to communicate and control the drone. And why is this huge? Well, the nature of these plasmas are that they have an extremely high charge density, extremely high. They also have a natural asymmetry. We were talking about asymmetries and how it creates this pressure or with electric field. They have a natural asymmetry where electrons are not repelling each other. They're not neutralizing within the plasma like you would expect, which to me is like basically an unlimited battery. So you've got this thing that can produce a huge amount of charge relative to its size. It's got these self-organizing and self-sustaining properties, meaning that it forms a torus that forms a sphere, and then after that, it sustains itself. So Ken Shoulders called them exotic vacuum objects because he believed they must be cohering energy from the vacuum in order to be sustainable like this. So I bring this up because I think that you may have some insights into it. I don't know how much you know about the plasma stuff.
Yeah.
I want you to listen to this guy talk about it for a couple minutes. I think that somebody figured out that there's probably several different ways to do it with microwaves, RF waves, or just being able to produce some kind of standing wave within the plasma that allows it to become coherent, where now it can just float freely. But also what happens is it changes the permittivity of space. The plasma itself being there pushes out the 0 point energy. So to really bring this all around, why does this connect to Hal Puthoff? Because Hal Puthoff was writing the papers explaining these concepts. And Ken Shoulders wrote a paper, and by the way, he was partners with Hal Puthoff. Ken Shoulders wrote a paper called Permittivity Transitions, where he says that basically he realized in 1980 that from a paper by Bergstrom, the paper was from 1973, that there really is an ether. And that if there really is an ether and there really is a medium, now we can start playing around with the medium. We can play around with the permittivity of free space, which changes the speed of light. And I think it's really interesting because based on what you were just talking about with time and, having these collisions that were happening more often, like, somehow they were manipulating time with these experiments, with these this energy that they were creating with their electrodes, is that this is also, in my opinion, the answer to cold fusion and fusion in general. I don't think hot fusion is ever going to work. I think that with hot fusion, we were like, let's just heat it up and then there'll be more collisions because there's more energy. But we should have been thinking about it in terms of time, which is if we manipulate the rate of time, then we're going to have more collisions. And we don't need temperature for that at all. It can be cold. This is something where Sal Pais has been saying on a lot of interviews, even going back a year ago. It's all about cold plasma. So before we watch this clip, I would postulate to you to think about, and to the audience to think about, what if we discovered some natural phenomenon, plasma, that has properties that we can't recreate with metamaterials. At least not now. Maybe a civilization that's like 1,000 years more advanced than us can do it. But right now, we just don't have the material science for it. But we found the workaround, which is that we can make this ball of plasma, and now we can get a lot of the same magical effects that normally we would have to be like 1,000 years more advanced for. This is what the context I want you to have when we listen to this, because I think this guy worked with Hal Puthoff on the Sapphire Project, and I think the Sapphire Project was basically a front for this EVO plasma research. So let's play this clip here. It's like 2 or 3 minutes.
Perfect sense. But now, if you have this self-organizing plasma and it's producing an EVO in the central column, it could develop this superconducting double layer, which would almost be like a layer of electrons that have formed Cooper pairs and become superconducting. Now, what's so interesting about that is I believe from the research I have done that it's a superconducting state, which is highly interactive with the vacuum, with the 0-point energy field. And basically, you can create a bubble of what's called magnetic vector potential around the craft. Now, this is a very important concept I want to get across here about magnetic vector potential. See, originally, Maxwell, back in the 1800s, produced the first theory of electromagnetism, of electrodynamics. And in his original theory, the primary movers of electromagnetism was the scalar potential and the vector potential. And forget the term potential. That's really not a good descriptor of this. But the scalar potential, just imagine for a moment that there's a river and you're underneath the surface of the river. The scalar potential would be the pressure of the water all around you, pushing against your body. That's the scalar or the static potential. That's always there. The vector potential would be the force of the current flowing against your body, pushing against you in a specific direction, a specific vector. That's the vector potential. The magnetic and electric fields are just various manifestations of the scalar and vector potentials. A magnetic field is just a curled vector potential, for example. And so with a flux liner, you're creating a bubble of vector potential around the craft.
Right.
Then if you pulse it, because remember, the flux liner was designed as like a high frequency Tesla coil. If you pulse it, that creates another gradient in the vector potential, which is critical. Also, if you make this bubble asymmetrical in shape, that's important by creating another level of a gradient. Also, you can even do things. There's a secondary propulsion system in the flux liner too, which were the dielectric materials at the very base. They were these copper, it was layers of copper and dielectric, this green material. And basically what makes perfect sense for this green material, the dielectric material, would have been doped barium titanate. And it would have had a high K value, which would be a high capacitive value. And what's so interesting about this is that type of ferroelectric material can have a natural nonlinearity about it. So you have all these ways of adding an additional gradient. So you have the natural property of the EVO to be highly interactive with the vector potential. And then you have all these extra gradients from being pulsed at high frequency and having the shape of the craft and having the properties of the dielectric. And it all contributes to having a higher pressure on one side, a weaker pressure on the other side, and creating a net movement. Because gravity, this is a key concept I want your listeners to grasp. Gravity, mass, and inertia are all electrical phenomena. They are all manifestations of the scalar and vector potentials.
So now you see why I wanted you to listen to that, right? You were already dropping a lot of those terms at the beginning of this interview, and I was sitting here like, I don't want to spoil what I'm about to play. So what do you think? What do you think of his understanding? He's a big fan of you.
Yeah. So I've written about those things, and I'm sure he's thought about it and researched it himself, and probably incorporated it into his understanding of how, let's say, the flux liner works. So kudos to him for applying it in such a original and creative way. Like insightful way. Because for example, earlier when I talked about the flux liner and how the bottom layer was like a bifield Brown capacitor kind of a thing, he talks about how they had different layers and how they were doped. Okay, now what does he mean by doping? Doping means you have the different layers have different Ks, different dielectric constants, and so when you put an electric field through the stack of layers, the electric field here is going to be different from the one here, different from the one there. It's going to be a compression in that direction, okay? It's going to be compression in that direction. And that creates a linear, well, quote unquote linear nonlinearity in the electric field. And so when you have nonlinearities in the electric field, you're generating something new. Okay, so the same way that a gradient in the voltage leads to an electric field, well, a gradient, which is really a divergence in the electric field, leads to X. It's just to something else, which is probably electrogravitation. It's probably what it is. Now, a lot of these things, they are evident within the equations. So ultimately, a lot of the stuff is in the math. So if you understand the mathematics, then you can look at an equation and you can say, okay, well, that part there corresponds to this physical process. And if I want to apply it, this is the sort of physical experiment or setup that I have to do in order to make it be that way. All right. So one of the theories that I had in my paper, A Brief Introduction to Scalar Physics, is that the divergence of the magnetic vector potential, in other words, how much this water flow that he's talking about diverges or converges upon a point, like in a radial direction. This expansion or contraction of the ether corresponds or is interrelated in some way to the gravitational potential and therefore also to the rate of time itself. So what this means is if you can control the vector potential, which you can do through charge densities and through currents, and just arranging them in a certain geometric way, if you can control that, then you can control the gravitational potential and therefore you can control time as well. Then it's just a matter of how much charge density you can compact into a certain space and how much you can make it modulate. And so that's exactly what you're talking about with those plasmoids, those stable plasma things, where that is nature's own mechanism for compacting as much charges as possible into the smallest volume. Okay, that's how you get the greatest charge density. And so when you have such a high level of charge density and you modulate its size, that is a way of generating radial longitudinal waves.
Wow. That's mind-blowing to think about.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of sense. It's like, I love the thing you just said about nature. It's like nature's way of fitting the most charge into that region. When I first spoke to Sal Pais, my first thought was like, I kept thinking I was all on board the metamaterial thing. Alien, they figured out somewhere it must be a metamaterial. But doesn't it just make so much more sense that nature is going to have the most efficient mechanism and it's not going to be some material that we've got? That to me makes the most sense out of all of it. And then when I heard him talking about these ideas, these cold plasmas, and I looked back at the MH370 videos and I'm just going, wow, this is really the answer, because this is where Sal's whole Pais effect is, that he's saying that, to your point, what is the amount of energy you can fit, electromagnetic flux you can fit within a region of space-time. Sal's thing is that the most is the Schwinger limit, is that once you hit the Schwinger limit, Julian Schwinger, Nobel Prize winner, 1965, when you hit that level of energy density, you're breaking through the fabric of reality. You could argue you're like looking at the true nothingness at that point. You're looking down through whatever the ether is, you're looking at it at that point. So yeah, I think that, and then this also speaks to the idea of these EVOs. What they're doing then is they're changing the permittivity of space-time in that region. That's going to manipulate the speed of light in that region. And now it's, now what do you have? You have a ball of energy floating around. And the other thing that I realized, I'm curious to get your thoughts on all of this, is that one of the biggest scientific things that I found was something called the dynamic Casimir effect. You hear people talk about the Casimir effect all the time in this topic. And why? Because it proves 0 point energy is real. For the people out there going, well, is 0 point energy even real? Yes, the Lamb shift proves it's real. Casimir effect proves it's real. Ehrenhoff-Bohm effect proves it's real. All of these things prove there's something there. Why does science ignore them? I don't know. I don't really care at the end of the day. But this energy level, if we can break through this, then we can create these types of effects that we've been writing about in physics, which is like wormholes, portals, things like that. They require these huge amounts of energy to pull off. So what is your thoughts? And do you have any other background thoughts or anything I haven't brought up about EVOs in general? And oh, sorry, I forgot the other thing I was going to say about the dynamic Casimir effect, is that they think the dynamic Casimir effect, they being physicists, They think the dynamic Casimir effect happens at the event horizon of black holes. That's one of the astrological locations, cosmological locations where we see the dynamic Casimir effect happen. If you read about the dynamic Casimir effect, it basically says that the Schwinger effect is happening. Is that these virtual particle pairs that are constantly popping in and out of existence, they get captured from the Schwinger effect. And what happens? They become real photons. Photon is just light. So to me, if you add this up and you say, if we're creating like a black hole or a little permittivity change in a region of space, and we've got our plasma here, then it's going to be glowing because it's going to be something inside there is pulling photons out of the ether if it's really interacting with the ether, like Ken Shoulders would say. What is your thoughts on any and all of that?
Yeah, so the 0-point energy field, the way that some physicists understand it is that you have these virtual particles, or including virtual photons, that pop in and out of existence. And they do it within a time span that is allowed by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? So there's a very, very small window of time where things can pop in and pop out, but it's enough to generate a collective effect that leads to 0-point energy effects, okay? And I think what you're talking about there, what they were talking about, has to do with bringing a system right up to that threshold where when something tries to pop into existence in a pair and an anti-pair thing, well, there's sort of like one is above the threshold and one is beneath the threshold. So therefore you get this asymmetric effect. You break the symmetry that normally combines them back to zero. So imagine you generate a 1 and a -1, and normally they collapse back to zero. Well, what if as soon as that 1 pops out, you like throw that into a black hole, and then the other one you leave outside of the black hole? Well, now all of a sudden you've got this -1 out of nowhere without a 1 to cancel it back out. So you get something out of nothing. Okay, that's sort of what you're talking about there. And I mean, another way of understanding that would be you are biasing the 0-point energy field so that you get a net fluctuation that comes out of it. So
it's like
that's
an oil well, right? But you've just tapped into an unlimited supply of energy at that point. You're creating something that's pulling the energy out.
Yeah, and that sort of energy then would be in the form of either they're not virtual particles anymore; they're real particles now, and they could be electrons. They could be electrons, and also photons. So some sort of radiation. It could be light, it could be gamma rays, X rays, whatever. And actually, interestingly enough, a lot of these supposed UFOs, they do generate these energy fields. They generate particles like electric fields around them, in addition to glowing in a plasmatic sort of way, and people getting ultraviolet radiation burns when they get a little bit too close to them. So they're generating very, very intense energy fields, and perhaps they are creating a shell around themselves that's almost like an event horizon, for all we know. Maybe that's what they're doing, But no doubt that a lot of these ships, they do use plasmas to do a lot of what they do. So imagine if you do have a metal vehicle, and the skin of it you can electrify in such a way that you create a plasmoid around yourself. So you're encased in a plasma. You're like a flying ball of lightning, basically. So you can imagine what you can do with that. You can nullify inertia. You can alter gravity. You can probably alter the rate of time. And actually, funny enough, Stefan Marinov and the Magvid device, which I think I linked that to you once.
Yeah.
So the Magvid device, this was device that Stefan Marinov, he's a Bulgarian physicist who died under very mysterious circumstances, but that was the final device that he built before he was killed. And the official story is that he committed suicide by jumping off a university building. But in truth, when he landed, one of the people that found him found that there was this weird green glowing fluid leaking out the back of his fractured skull, almost like radiator fluid from a car, like a coolant or something.
Was he an alien?
Well, no. The theory is that he was probably mind controlled, like injected with some sort of thing and made to jump off. Yeah, but see, he was fully conscious, and he probably would have recovered. But an ambulance showed up, a mysterious ambulance, and took him away, and he died on the way to the hospital. And I think they tried to trace where that ambulance came from, and it wasn't an official ambulance. So, yeah, so something went on there, But anyway, so this Magvid device, it stands for magnetic vortex hyper.
I looked into this actually. Yeah. Because you sent me this. What I can't remember. There's something relevant to this maglev. But yeah, I looked into it and I thought it looked very plausible. And just not to necessarily change the subject, we can talk more about that. But something I was just looking at yesterday actually was I decided to pull up Sal's here it is, sorry. Sal's patent for inertial craft using inertial mass reduction device.
Mhm.
And one thing you notice, how do I make this go over somewhere else? Let me try to pop this out. There we go. Oh, hold on. Let me switch my share screen here. This craft, Sal says there's a cavity here. This triangle craft is using a cavity that has xenon gas or another noble gas in it, which I believe is an insulator. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that could this outside be this plasma field that's being generated? And could the energy be using this cavity here to create the cold plasma on the outside? I don't know. Looking at this image, that looks like what he's trying to represent on this image.
Yeah,
What do you?
yeah. Well, man, it's been a while since I read that patent, so I can't remember. But I mean, it does look like it, and I know that he does incorporate plasma into some of his technology. So, and you have to if you want really high charge densities.
Yeah,
You have to use plasmas. It's just as mentioned, it's nature's way of doing it most efficiently. So, yeah.
So yeah, I think that my opinion is this, and this is kind of what I want to get your last thoughts on this here. May ask one or two more questions, but what is your thoughts on this hypothesis that I don't think I've stolen this from anybody else, but maybe other people have had the same thought. What if any civilization kind of figures out that plasma is the secret? They all figure out that we can't get the energy densities we need without plasma. And so that would mean that plasma is kind of like discovering fire, like you start rubbing sticks together and you realize, oh, we can make fire happen. Look at that. And then do we still rub sticks together? I don't. I was making a fire earlier today and I just used my lighter, right? And I start the fire up. And we don't really ask why fire works the way that it does or who figured it out, whatever. We just say it exists. It's a property of nature that happens. And then, you could get into the long, complicated explanation for how and why it's working. But what if plasma is like that? And what if then now the hurdle to achieving this magical technology is just discovering a property of nature? It's not even a matter of achieving some level of material science or understanding. What is your thoughts on that theory? And I think the reason why I like it is going back to what you said at the beginning when I asked you what you think the nature of the UFO phenomenon is that it opens the door to everything. Is that it could be partially us. We could have figured some of this out. We could have figured it out from aliens. We could have figured it out from digging something up. We could have figured it out on our own. It also opens the door to some of this stuff flying around being us, but some of it also being aliens using a similar foundation of technology, all based on plasma. What do you think?
Yeah, I think plasma is quite foundational. Now, for us as humans with our budget, our labs, our garages, our basements, plasma, I think, is the way to go to get those charge densities that we need to have very strong effects. And in case people are wondering, like, why is it that charge densities have any effect on anything? Well, it's because charge itself, electric charges, they seem to have a grip on the ether. And so that's why when you send a current down a wire, it drags a little bit of ether with it. And so you get this vector potential flowing alongside the outside of the wire because it's being dragged along by the charge. And so when you take charges and you compress them together, if you compress charges together in a motion like this, then what you're doing is you're also compressing the ether. So you're modulating the ether by modulating charge density. And the greater the charge density, the stronger your grip on the ether, and the more you affect the 0-point energy field, and so on. So that's why charges are so important, is because they literally grab the ether. They alter time, like the Bifield-Brown effect, okay? The Bifield-Brown effect, you just have a capacitor, a high-voltage capacitor. So one's charged super high, negative, and the other one either is at ground or super high negative voltage. And just with that alone, you get a propulsive force because you're altering the ether in an asymmetric way. So the ether wants to flow, to rebalance it. And so therefore you get this motion. And so the reason why I bring that up is because, I think plasma is the most efficient way to do it because that's how nature does it. Ball of lightning, the sun, I'm actually fire itself as a plasma, funny enough. But yeah, I mean, you can use plasmas to do things that you can't with, let's say, copper conductors, because a copper conductor, you can only put so much energy into it before the copper melts, before the wire heats up and it melts. So you can't use the copper wire to do these super high powerful things. But if you use a plasma, which is nothing but charges, nothing but ions and electrons, then there's nothing there to melt, so you can keep on pumping energy into it until you reach the Schwinger limit or whatever sort of limit you're talking about, and then you start getting really, really weird effects. But one of the important things I forgot to mention earlier is that there are really two ways of getting these exotic effects. One is to cram just as much mass and energy and motion or whatever into a certain volume of space, and you end up curving space and time. You end up curving the ether. And that's what general relativity would recommend. And I think that's what Sal Paez is that's what he's going for. He's going for like extreme energy densities to warp space and time. But there is another way. And the other way is to first you alter the actual physical constants of space itself. The permittivity, the index of refraction of the ether. And if you alter those, then you don't need as much energy in order to get those effects. Okay, and that's something that, funny enough, Jack Sarfati, that's the thing that we talked about last time, the schmuck factor. So that thing, that is the variable that controls how much energy you need to warp a certain amount of space and time. And so if you can alter that first using scalar physics principles, by altering the density of the ether, if you can do that first, then the ether becomes more fluid, more pliable, softer, and you don't need as much energy per volume of space in order to open portals or alter time or anything like that. So that's why I think that some of these ships, whether they are shadow military or alien stuff, some of them probably are using a method of softening up the ether first before they apply the energy. So therefore, they don't have to have the energy equivalent of a massive star in order to open a portal. Maybe they don't need that. Maybe they just need a tiny fraction of that. But in correspondence to that, they've also softened up the ether in a massive way through the combination.
I think they're all connected. Honestly, yeah. I think that all these ideas and concepts are connected in a way where once we start seeing it experimentally, publicly, it's going to start to make a lot of sense. I think that we can reduce the energy requirements. I think we can amplify energy as well, and I think we can pull free energy out of the ether, all of the above. And I think we're going to find that, there's a relationship between them all. Tom Bearden, he would talk about tickling the ether with a little bit of energy. And that's kind of what he's talking about. He's like saying that find the way to interact with the ether in a way that uses the least amount of energy. And I think that Ken Shoulders maybe has either discovered that or discovered one way to do that with plasmas. And I loved what you mentioned about the electricity. I want to go back to that for a second, because I always mention this Veritasium video. He's my favorite physicist out there, Veritasium on YouTube. Does this video, I think it was like a year or two ago, about electricity doesn't flow through wires. Mm-hmm. And he finds that, yes, there's electricity is flowing through fields. You could say it's flowing through the ether, from one point to the other, but it's not technically flowing through the wires. The wires are just kind of acting as conduits, for lack of a better term.
Yep.
And why is this so huge? Because of what you just said about the electricity, electrons, they are connecting to the ether. They are coupling to the ether. So now if you think about it from that perspective, this perspective of electricity is coupled to the ether. And then you can look back at Hal Puthoff's papers, specifically his polarizable vacuum or metric, space-time metric engineering. What he's talking about is basically like taking Microsoft Paint and doing a little cutout of a region. Make a bubble, or you can be any shape you potentially want, but like just roughly, let's say a bubble. And now you create like an eddy current. An eddy current is just like an area of space where you have a current difference, maybe a superconducting barrier. And now you've got a bubble. You've got a bubble in space-time, all created and produced by electricity, by electric charge. And I think that's what Ken Shoulders, I think this is where Ken Shoulders and Hal Puthoff's ideas overlapped and why they were partners with one another, because they both understood that space isn't empty and there's this ether. And they were both kind of like, Hal Puthoff was going Ken Shoulders was going the plasma route, going like, this is how we can create it. And then Hal Puthoff was kind of explaining it in the concepts. I personally think he got sucked into the black world as well. And I think he's a lot smarter than he lets on as well. He's a very smart guy. I think he knows way more stuff. So I guess thoughts on that and energy not flowing through the wires and what that means for how you manipulate space-time.
Yeah, it's an important thing. It's something I wanted to bring up for sure. So it's good that we got to this point. So in that Veritasium video, it did talk about how energy is not flowing through the wire, it's actually flowing in the space around the wire, and the quantity that they refer to is the Poynting vector, Poynting. And the Poynting vector is equal to the electric field crossed with the magnetic field. So E cross B. So if you got electric field this way, magnetic field this way, then the Poynting vector, is either this way or that way. I didn't keep track of my directions, but it's perpendicular to both of them, right?
Yeah.
So, but see that what he's saying is it flows like how energy flows with a photon. Because in a photon, you have the electric field in one direction, you got the magnetic field perpendicular to that, and then you have the direction of motion perpendicular to both of those. And that's what the pointing vector is. It's the direction of energy flow that flows electromagnetically. And as you and I have been discussing this entire time, there's more things than just transverse electromagnetic waves. There are other forms of, you could say, waves or ripples in the ether. Okay, so think about it this way: the pointing vector, if that is E cross B, in other words, E at the right angles to B, then how do you make this transverse electromagnetic flow zero? There's different ways to do it. One, you can have the E and the B be in the same direction, right? They're not perpendicular to each other, so the perpendicular component is actually zero. All right, so if you have the E and the B in the same direction, then you don't get a pointing vector and you don't get loss of energy. And that is what that 1992 Air Force paper that you've been citing recently.
Bring it up.
Yeah. By Jack
Champion.
Yep,
he says literally in there that the electric and magnetic fields are parallel
to
one another. And I kept reading that, and I wanted to talk to you about it because I was like, wait, is he saying, like, I couldn't understand exactly. I could tell it was profound.
Yeah.
But so what you're saying there is that he's creating a situation where you've canceled out, you've created a scalar potential. Is that, how would you interpret that?
You created a situation where you don't get radiation in a typical way. So in other words, if you have this ball of plasmoid stuff, it's not going to be leaking energy outward and like fizzling out to nothing. It's going to be self-sustaining, at least for a period of time. And that's what ball lightning is. Ball lightning appears and it goes around for a while, and eventually it fizzles out, when it destabilizes. But for that period of time, all these charges are compacted together and they're not dissipating, right?
Wow.
So that's one situation where you're canceling out the pointing vector by making E and B parallel, so that there's no perpendicular component, right? So that's one way to do it. Wow. The other way to do it is to make the magnetic field zero, but leave the electric field. So if you have the electric field but no magnetic field, even if the electric field is oscillating, if you cancel out the magnetic field, then it's E cross zero. That is equal to zero. That's also a situation where the pointing field, and you know what that is? You know what that is? That is Ken Shoulders' EVO. That is what it is. Because in his paper, in his book, EV: A Tale of Discovery, in that book, that last chapter.
Oh, you call it a book? I call it like memoirs, but that's an amazing read for people.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, because man, that book, you can tell his passion. You can tell that he understands what he's talking about. He's in it. It's not like some academic
story he tells. That's where he says that he learned that the ether was real in 1980, and he talks openly about his relationship with Hal Puthoff and Bill Church, who was the owner of Church's Chicken at the time. Like, that needs to be made into a movie. Anyway, please keep going.
Yeah. All right. So in that paper, near the end, he talks about his theory about what these EVOs are, and what he thinks they are is he thinks that they are monopole oscillations of electric charge densities. It's a long phrase, but what it really means is a spherical oscillating density of charge, right? So in other words, the electric field is pointing outwards in a radial direction, and it's increasing and decreasing because the charges are moving. It's actually generating a vector potential in a radial symmetrical way. That's what it's doing. Okay, it's generating a spherical longitudinal waves into the ether. Okay, except what makes it stable is that it's oscillating in such a way that it is in resonance with the ether itself. Okay, so because it's resonating at a frequency that is in resonance with the ether, any sort of longitudinal energy that does go out gets reflected back. So it's it's like if you and I and a bunch of people were in a mosh pit and we're all like pushing out against each other. Normally we would disperse, but if there's a crowd around us that is pushing back in time with us, then we just kind of stay together as a group in the center of the mosh pit. So that's how it is. These electrons are trying to push apart, but then the ether pushes it back, and there's this oscillation going on. And so that's what he's talking about. He's talking about these radial charge oscillations. That's his version of a plasmoid. Whereas the Jack Nachamkin paper, that's slightly different. That's where you got the E and the B non-zero, but they're in parallel. So you get this like solenoidal, toroidal spherical shape, right? And it's similar, but it's different from Ken Shoulders stuff. But it's to our eyes, both of them will look like plasmoids. It's just one is like a torus, and the other one is radiating like this, Like it's not radiating, but it's moving like that. But yeah, but both of them, the pointing vectors are 0 because there is no E cross B that's non-zero. Interestingly enough, so
which one's the one that's compressing and decompressing? Ken Shoulders or Jack
yeah,
McCann?
Ken Shoulders. So when he talks about monopoles at the end of his paper, he's talking about electric monopoles, not magnetic monopoles. He's
Wow,
just
so
talking about charge densities
I've
that
been
go like this.
interpreting it wrong this whole time. I mean,
Yeah,
fundamentally same concept, but yeah, wow.
yeah.
Wow, that is mind blowing, man, that you brought that up. Thank you for talking about that. Yeah, and that's the thing where the Nichampkin paper goes and takes it a step further, and from Nichampkin's approach says, well, if you create this vortex, just like a whirlpool where you're pulling the water out of the tub, then it can stabilize the field and therefore become stable. And I also wonder, do you think that there might be a requirement or like, do you think it has to be modulated in such a way where it has to be in some kind of equilibrium with the atmosphere as well? Like, does it have to be like the same temperature as the background atmosphere or close? That kind of gets alluded to in the Champkin paper. And it was an interesting thought that I had never considered. I just assumed that if you can make a bubble, then it's completely separated from everything else. But what if there is some criteria where it needs to be within a certain threshold of the outside environment in order for it to stay stable? Otherwise, it'll become unstable.
Yeah, I think I think the environmental conditions, whether it's pressure, I mean, even the types of gases that are in the air, if there's any sort of particle exchange with a plasmoid, because think about it, you can make a plasmoid probably in a field of pure hydrogen, or you can make another one in a field of pure like argon or something, right? So if you make one within atmosphere, it's going to be made of hydrogen, or I mean nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and all these other things that separate and so on, like a little bit of water vapor. So yeah, I mean the plasmoid would definitely be made of the stuff of the gas that it forms within, and so therefore it would have an interaction with the environment, not only with the physical environment, but probably also the gravitational environment and the etheric environment. Like if the physical constant of electric permittivity were different, if the speed of light were different, then maybe it would be a bigger plasmoid instead of a smaller one, a more compact one, or vice versa, right? So the environmental conditions ultimately end up determining the size of the plasmoid, probably its color, probably what frequency it's oscillating at. All these things, kind of converge together. And think about this: what if the electron itself is a plasmoid in the ether? And what if electric charge and the mass of the electron, what if those things only appear because those are the environmental conditions that it exists within? What if the very properties of the ether are what give the electron its supposed charge? I think that's probably what's going on.
Oh, I totally agree with you. And you've really helped me to conceptualize these balls of plasma. So then in terms of, do you think they could be created then through anything? And do you think they could, like, I've wondered, because I keep thinking of the MH370 videos, and they closely match what you were describing with Ken's shoulders, the oscillation that's going on there. I think that if those videos are real, then those orbs are pulling the electrons directly from the atmosphere. Like, I don't think they're in a glass container of argon or some other gas or whatever it is. And one of the papers I read, I don't remember which one, maybe it was Nichampkin, maybe it was one of the others. They said that it can be tuned to any frequency, meaning that it can be any color of light that they can emit, and they might even be able to be invisible. So do you think that they could be invisible? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, because so within plasmas, when you try to create a plasma in a lab, one of the easiest ways to do that is you get like a evacuated chamber, like a vacuum tube or something. You got 2 electrodes in there, right? So one's ground, one's a cathode, one's the anode, and you pump a certain level of current into it, certain level of voltage, and it ionizes the remaining gases that are in there, right? And so as you increase the current, you get this curve. It's a curve that's common to all such plasmas, and at the very beginning of it, there's a kind of dark plasma. It's called the Townsend regime. It's within that regime. That particular phase of plasma where you don't get any light emission, so it's dark, but it is still a plasma. There's actual plasmatic processes going on in there, but it's invisible, optically invisible, because it's not emitting necessarily any light. So if you have these orbs, right? So if their technology is advanced enough, they could create these plasmoid orbs that are within that particular regime or something like it, where it's not emitting light, but it is invisible. And I think Ken Shoulders, didn't he talk about dark EVOs as well.
Yeah, people are
Yeah,
probably
like-
watching this right now, screaming in the chat, "Dark EVOs!" Because and also the Sapphire project, they had a mode where it was completely dark. The plasma was on, there was voltage being given to it, but it was just black, not emitting any light whatsoever.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, since we're on that topic, let me mention something briefly. So within that curve, this chasm, this plasma curve, if you get up to a certain point, okay, so beyond this Townsend regime, beyond this cold plasma regime, you get to what's called the normal glow discharge. And that's like when you got the electrode, like in the Sapphire Project videos, you got this electrode and like little glowing dots start to appear around it, right? And then they start to move a little bit. That's the normal glow discharge phase. And eventually it gets so bright that the entire thing gets covered in like a uniform layer of glow. And that's called the abnormal glow discharge phase. Okay, that's higher up in the curve. But then something very interesting happens, because once you reach that state, you can turn down the voltage a little bit, and it'll start retracing that curve and go back to the cold plasma state.
Really?
But it's a different kind of cold plasma state. It's like a plasma has two states to it, like two parallel states to it. And when you go up in voltage, you go along the bottom one, and then when you trace back, you actually come back this other parallel way, where now you've got this kind of cold plasma instead of this kind. So there's another kind of cold plasma that exists besides the one that you first encounter when you first start applying voltage. And it's within that other secondary one, that's where you start getting really weird effects like transmutation and probably like cold fusion, something like that. Start getting these weird effects because that is a state where you have both electrons and ions, like protons or whatever, it's like hydrogen gas, where they are in an equally distributed, uniform admixture of ions colliding with electrons. And there's a paper by Harold Ashton. What's it called? Let me look it up real quick. Harold Ashton, it's a paper called Power from Space, the Correa invention, Correa invention. And he's talking about the Dr. Paolo Correa, who worked with free energy systems involving plasma. So anyway, in that book, he talks about how when you have a heavy ion, like a hydrogen or helium atom or something like that, colliding with a light one, like electron, that difference in mass and both of them having charge, it does something exotic. Okay, it does something exotic where it generates free energy somehow. You get extra energy out of that interaction. The greater the difference in mass is between the heavy ion and the small electron. All right, so the reason why I bring that up is because within that secondary cold plasma state, that is where you have the maximum number of ions interacting with the maximum number of electrons. And the more they do that, the more free energy is being generated. So within cold plasma, a certain kind of it, you do get these exotic free energy and other effects. Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing and the biggest takeaway from the plasma as well, is that you go back to, like, you just recapping what we've talked about this whole thing, is that we've talked about the nature of the suppression of the UFO phenomenon, what it could be, what the national security issue is, the technology. And then you go, well, what is this technology? To me, all signs are pointing towards plasma. Plasma's got these properties that we need. And it turns out, like you just mentioned, I came to the same conclusion, that it's like basically an infinite battery. This natural property of this plasma is just producing what we would think of as free energy, but it's not really free. It goes back to the dynamic Casimir effect. You're pulling energy out of the ether, and we're sending this other particle somewhere else, and this gives us a net positive amount of energy in our observable reality. Now, it's at the cost of something. We took energy out of the ether. And this also speaks to a lot of these free energy devices. They cool things down. Like that. There's a serial video that I could show right now, but I'm not going to. I've shown it several times on my stream, where they show this John Cyril free energy device recreation. And over the 5 or 10 minute video, it actually cools down to the point where the center magnet has frost on it. It's gotten so cold, and they have a thermal thing on it as well. So really the point I'm trying to make for people is it's true. There is no free lunch. So even if you're pulling energy out of this ocean of energy, you're pulling this energy out, you're pulling energy out of that region, which naturally is going to cool things down as well. So there's always going to be consequences no matter what. We can't cheat the laws of physics. We can just break them, or we can just bend them a little bit. Right. So I guess this is probably a good time to close it down. We've had a great conversation, Tom. We spoke about plasma. You gave me some new great insights into cold plasmas. We spoke about free energy gravity manipulation. We spoke about aliens, non-human intelligence, UFO phenomenon, the UFO hearings, Hal Puthoff, etc. Is there anything else you want to mention before we close out?
Yeah, I want to say for you guys that are interested in this fringe physics stuff, check out the works of David Maker. David Maker. David Maker, he's a smart guy, and what he did was he reverse engineered general relativity. He did to general relativity what me and others have done with Maxwell's equations to find the hidden avenues that would expand it. And based on that expansion of general relativity, he found equations that show how rotating charges, especially if they wobble on their axis, are able to produce gravitational fields, are able to couple to space-time and to warp space-time in a very efficient and effective way. Not only that, but he also figured out that it does it, especially if you bring the voltage up to, I think it was either 511,000 volts or 512,000 volts. But there's a singularity in voltage there, where if you take this rotating charge system and you bring it up to that voltage, as soon as you hit that, you get like a massive burst of thrust, or either increase in weight or decrease in weight. So David Maker, let's see, is that the one? I'm trying to see on the screen.
I don't know if this is the paper, but this is him for sure. I found this last time we spoke, and I started digging into David Maker quite a bit, actually. At the time, it was well beyond me, but I should take another look at it now because I've heard, let me just say this real quick, is that I've talked to engineers behind the scenes that I've never spoken about that have brought up David Maker as well, which is why I got really interested when you brought it up. So
interesting. Okay, yeah, interesting. He's got like 4 papers on ResearchGate. I think one of them was co-authored with Glenn Robertson, who used to work for the team that Amy Eskridge was part of.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there's a connection. There's like 2 degrees of separation between Amy Eskridge and David Maker, and they probably knew each other for all I know. They probably did. But anyway, that science that he figured out is what Podkletnov is doing, is implementing in the lab. Rotating charges whose axis of rotation wobbles. Okay, so if you look up one of Podkletnov's more recent experiments from like 5-10 years ago. I say recent because he goes back to the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's a video where it's like a vacuum chamber and he's got like a metal disc in there and it's on an axis like a motor, and he spins it up and there's like a weight that's suspended above it, and this weight starts wobbling with gravitational pulses due to the gravity being generated by this rotating disc. And the disc is not superconducting. It has it takes too long to explain, but long story short, it's an aluminum disc. It's got gold rings impregnated into it, and there's it builds up very high charge densities at the interface between the gold and the aluminum, and it does it naturally without any additional energy input. And so when you spin that around and you make it wobble like that on the axis, you get this gravitational impulse. So that's an example of him doing that. But he said that particular method is not very efficient, and that the most efficient way to do it would be through rotating magnetic fields, which is what that magvid that Stephen Marinoff developed. That's what that is. He's creating extremely high frequency rotating magnetic fields that were operating at like 75 megahertz. And there's no way you can build a mechanical physical disk that rotates that fast. I mean, that's like 75 million times per second. You can't do that, right?
No, the reason why the plasma is so big, because the plasma, now you have just this nebulous gas that can move in any direction that you need. It makes a lot of sense. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So to finish up the magvid thing, what he had 2 sets of coils, right? So one set of coil was like this, another set of coils was like this, and each one produced a magnetic field. Okay, but each set of coils was pumped in quadrature, meaning one was given a sine wave, the other was given a cosine wave, so they're like 90 degrees apart in time. And when you do that with that sort of setup, what you end up getting, you get a synthetic rotating magnetic field. And so anything that's in that rotating magnetic field, if it responds to magnetism, the orbitals or the electron orbitals will align with it. So, I mean, that's how magnets work. When you put iron near a magnet, the orbitals, right? So what happens is, because magnetism itself within a magnet or iron or ferrite, because it involves electrons going around in orbit like that, if you have a rotating magnetic field, you have rotating charges that their axis of rotation ends up rotating itself at 75 megahertz in this case. And that is the David Maker thing, where you've got rotating charges whose axis is either wobbling or rotating entirely. Okay. At high voltages. So that's what his device was doing. It was actually ionizing the air, and then electrons were coming out the top and circulating and going around up through the bottom. He was creating a plasmoid using rotating magnetic fields. Yeah, and according to rumors of people that saw the device in demonstration, it warped time and it produced free energy. So
This is
no
the
wonder
Marinov device.
yeah, the
Wow.
Marinov Magvid device. So no wonder he died within 2 weeks after producing something like
Yeah,
that.
and I think we've reached a point now where maybe this is what we'll end on is that what do you think's changed between that was probably like what the 70s or something and now? Because it seems like something has changed from my perspective. Because I'm still alive and I've been
Yeah.
exposing all this science and technology. You are too, right? And you might just say, well, we're just small fish in a big pond, and we're making small ripples, but we're not making big change. But
Yeah.
it does feel like they're letting some of this stuff come out, and some of it, like I think we are in agreement that's the technology that they're afraid of coming out. But what is it you think changed? Do you think that they've just given up? They've gotten tired of hiding it? Do you think that it's going to come out inevitably anyway? Do you think there's another explanation? What do you think's going on?
Yeah, I think there's a timetable that they have towards where they want this to come out because they can. So the thing is, if you release it prematurely, then we would not have been on this geopolitical track that we've been on for the past 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they wanted this to happen until a certain point in the future. It could be within 10 years, it could be within 30 years, who knows? But
Yeah.
I think, well, I mean, we are reaching various technological singularities, even with AI, right? Coming up
Yeah.
within the next 10, 20 years. So I think they want it to happen during that time period and not a moment before. So if someone tries to come out with a free energy device before that they're ready for it, before they have all the pieces in play to exploit it, that's not good for them, because then we'd be preempting them. So they're going to kill us off if we do it beforehand. But so like right now, you and I, we can talk about this. We can talk about this, and you've known people that probably have working devices, okay? But it's when they have working devices that they're going to release to the world that affects things on an economic, political, geopolitical level. That's when they get whacked. So we're still in the danger zone, but at least we can talk about it.
Yeah, and people ask me like, "Hey, Ashton, what happened with your whole EtherTech free energy device thing that you were doing?" And I say, "Just do you listen to what Tom just said right there? It's one thing to talk about it conceptually. It's also another thing to see it with your own eyes. It's a whole nother thing to try to get on CNN with it, right? And when you start to try to do those types of things, that's when you see the full force of the suppression. That's when you see the disinformation people come out and say." I mean, I actually researched this. There's several people who literally, they're PhD physicists whose job it is to testify on behalf of the government that when people are developing free energy devices, that they're kooks and cranks and that it's pseudoscience and all this stuff. It's scary to see that stuff. And some of these people might even believe it themselves.
Oh, I'm sure they do. Yeah.
And that's so it goes to show that, guys, like, this isn't a game. Like, there's something happening at a major level here. And this physics is real. Many people have discovered it throughout time. We can push as hard as we can, but ultimately, I guess the last question for you is, so what do we do? Knowing all this information, knowing the history of the suppression on it, Tom, what is your view on how we progress?
I think the best thing would be to use weaponized open source crowdsourcing of this information, because then it's not just one person, one inventor who has something. So the typical pattern is an inventor discovers something amazing. They think about it. Should I release this to the world? No, I spent like 10, 20 years developing it.
Make money off this.
I should make money off this. Okay, all right, fine. I'm going to make money off this. So therefore, I have to keep it secret. I have to try to get investors and I have to start signing deals. And this process takes time. And you start signaling to the powers that be that, hey, I've got something, but I haven't released it to the world yet. So if you kill me off now, I will never release it. And guess what happens? That's what happens. So Stan Meyer, he had his technology and he cloaked it in a lot of misdirection, And so therefore, when he was just about to sign that deal, he stood up and he claimed, I've been poisoned, and he falls over dead in the parking lot. People say it was a stroke, but it wasn't.
That I would say is that what if also there's this element of, I've seen this pattern where when people figure it out, they go, "Oh, it was that easy. Oh, everybody's going to figure this out like next year." They think like, "Oh, everyone's going to figure this out," and so they start, doing the same things. You said they start patenting things. They start trying to make investment deals. The thing they don't do is they don't start, putting it on the blockchain or doing a bunch of interviews. Usually they get like that, and then the problem is that it doesn't come out. It never comes out. And so
Yeah.
now we've just got people with these patents, and we've got all these patents out there that claim to be able to do free energy type stuff, and nobody thinks they're real and what have you. So there's an element of that.
Yeah. Yeah,
going on as well.
especially if the principle is simple, like you said. If it's very easy and they know that everyone else can figure out, usually what they end up doing is they end up releasing something about it because people are going to want to know anyway, but they misdirected with a bunch of complicated extras that don't need to be part of it. And so
they'll throw a little sabotage in there, so if somebody tries to copy it or whatever, that
right. And all of a sudden, everyone else,
because then everybody's like, "Oh, I'm going to recreate it," and I failed. It's like,
I know. And as people try to recreate it, and like, oh my god, I got to buy like $10,000 worth of materials to create the special magnet recipe or something. I'm talking about Floyd's Sweet, for example. Things like that. You know, the principle is probably very simple, but they added all this complicated conditions to it, and they say only if you do this and this and this and this do you get the effect. And then people try to replicate it, but of course they can't do everything, and it fails because they missed the original simple thing. And then the other problem is these inventors, they stumble upon something, but they don't 100% know why it's doing what it does, and so they have to come up with their own crazy theory about why it is. And so therefore you've got all these different inventors with their own crazy theories that all contradict each other about what it is. So if you had the unified theory that you could explain all of it with one common, correct, true science, instead of all these little half-baked attempts at trying to understand, like, oh, there's little gyroscopic ether particles, we'll call them etherons or something. And, you know, maybe that's the case, but I think most of the time they're just trying to grasp at what it could actually be. So there's so much misdirection. And plus then you got charlatans, right? And you've got probably like government disinformants in there as well, trying to lead people astray. It's a dangerous minefield. So like kudos to anyone like you or anyone else who's trying to really brave the dark, choppy waters and trying to figure out what that island of truth actually is.
Yeah, and I know we've been going for a while. I want to wind it down, but that reminded me too of I've reached out to a lot of physicists here and there about just input on what have you. One of them was a professor named David Greer from NYU, who he several years ago was making the rounds on the media for developing this tractor beam. And it's funny because I messaged him about it, and he got very defensive over the idea that there's no special physics going on. But he said it was magic. He couldn't explain it. And it goes to the point that you just mentioned, which is this idea that like a lot of people don't even know how they invented the thing they did. I'm like, do you think this could be like a negative energy laser that you're doing here? Because it has like the same properties. No, there's nothing exotic or magical going. It's just normal energy. And I'm going, well, yeah, I know it's everything is like there's anything that we can see, we have an explanation for it. But I just think that mindset is a good analogy to where academia is right now, where it's like we've got these ideas out there, we've spoken about them for 2 hours on this interview, and yet they don't get taken seriously. And we've seen these inventors, these papers. Some of these guys, like Ken Shoulders, this guy was developing microelectronics before microelectronics were a thing. He was developing drones before drones were a thing. These are not lightweight guys. These aren't random cranks in their garage. So what would be your message to humanity for the people out there wondering when this is going to come out? What would you tell them to reassure those people?
So the question is, what I'm about to say, is it reassuring or not? Okay. So there's an inventor that I used to know, and after he developed a breakthrough in developing a water-powered engine that actually truly just ran on water, like no other funny business. He was dead within a month and a half. I was about to go visit him to show him, see what he developed, and he died shortly after. But anyway, one of the things that he told me is that he thinks that one day there will come a time where mounting economic and climate and other disasters are going to just death by 1,000 cuts to the system. Yeah, so the government will not have the resources anymore to maintain their grip of control. And at that point, you will have a flourishing of suppressed inventions that can no longer be kept down because there's just no longer enough manpower to keep them suppressed.
What about the idea that war were to break out and we were to use them in war? Is that another possibility?
I would say that it would only be used in war if there is no other option. Like if America, like for example, America's Black Ops programs, if they themselves were at risk of being wiped out by invading Russians or aliens or whatever it is, then they would pull it out. But up until that point, I think it's a bigger risk to reveal it than to keep it secret, So they'll keep it secret until they can't anymore. So,
okay. Finish your thought. Sorry.
But the thing is, we can't really depend on them because that'll be their timetable. So I think it's up to us to continue doing the research, the experimentation, to open source it. And the thing is, if you're someone who does discover a magical principle like anti-gravity or free energy or something, you're going to have to make that hard choice. Are you going to be like Gollum in the Lord of the Rings with your precious? Or are you going to sacrifice yourself for humanity and put it out there in a way that can't be suppressed? You know, blockchain it, whatever, open source it. It's really the only way to go. I mean, that's the only way to do it.
I agree, man. And so my approach has been, we've just got to teach people. We've got to wake people up. And that's why I've been doing this podcast. That's why I wanted to talk to you today. That's why I do my live streams, is that this stuff is too hard for people to understand unless they have the framework to understand it. It was Richard Feynman that spoke about the idea. He was asked about what is magnetism. And he said, well, unless you understand the principles, then it doesn't make any sense to even try to explain magnetism to somebody. And I think that's true of a lot of this physics, is unless you understand that there's an ether, there's no point talking about free energy because you can't understand how it's possible.
Yeah.
So, Tom, I want to thank you very much. It's been an awesome conversation. Go ahead, shout out anyone you want, any of your content that you want. Let people know where they can find you.
Yeah, well, you can find me at montalk.net, montalk.net, and of course on Twitter and X as well. Like I got a YouTube channel at youtube.com/Tom Montalk. And yeah, I'm also the guy behind scalarphysics.com. So if you go to scalarphysics.com and you click on resources, there's like a list of various papers. It's not complete. I mean, you yourself have featured stuff on your channels that's like beyond what I've included there. So I'll have to update my list. But scalarphysics.com, you can go there. You can read my paper, Brief Introduction to Scalar Physics, that Mr. X has, that he lauded. And if he's listening, hey, man, hopefully we get to talk sometime. And hopefully you get to talk to Ashton.
Yeah, we could do a 3-way conversation. It'd be great. So
yeah,
thank you, Tom. I love it. This was another episode of Hard Truths. Everybody, thank you all. Have a great day, everyone. Peace.